In this deep dive into the Alpha Legion, we will cover everything we know about them, or at least what we think we know about them. Because with the Alpha Legion, everything could be true. Simultaneously, everything could be false. At one point, they were called the Ghost Legion. This was during the early days of the Great Crusade, and the 20th Legion would eventually garner a much more infamous name, the Alpha Legion, and their story is one of contradiction and shadows, spanning millennia, of secrets buried deep beneath lies, and truth so tangled even the emperor himself couldn't make heads or tails of it. Official records state that they were turned against the imperium by Horus during the Horus heresy, pledging their allegiance to chaos. Yet long before their fall, they were already legends of secrecy and operatives so cloaked in deception, matters of manipulation and underhanded tactic that we could not even be sure if they actually turned. And perhaps the single most greatest secret of this legion is that they did not have one primarch, but two, Alpharius and his twin, Omegon. Identical twins, not only in form, but in mind as well. Some claim that they were literally one soul split in two bodies. Others whispered that the entire legion's identity was built on that very twin deception from the onset. A duality of purpose that persists even now. However, there are those who posit that there is no official Alpha Legion anymore, that whatever they were has splintered so many times and folded in upon itself that it is beyond recognition. But then again, those same people are often the ones who tend to vanish before they can report anything new. And while that might seem like a coincidence, there are no coincidences when dealing with the Alpha Legion. Everything is circles within circles when dealing with them. Every last one of the Legion's veterans are specialists in infiltration, covert warfare, and deceit, as they have been trained to embed themselves for years, even decades or centuries, behind enemy lines, manipulating entire populations and pulling the strings of events without ever stepping into the light, as they can disguise themselves as almost anything in existence, since disguise are one of the more common things within the Alpha Legion, to the point that Alpha Legion operatives have masqueraded as individual loyalist Space Marines, entire squads, and there are even those who believe that there are current day loyalist chapters that are just expansive, interwoven Alpha Legion operatives who have been so immersed in their roles that they don't even realize that they are not the only ones who are disguised as loyalists. Amongst them move countless human agents, known only as operatives, who serve as spies, cult leaders, and saboteurs. Before even a single shot is fired, the Alpha Legion prepares the battlefield through extensive espionage and uncountable amounts of subversion, propaganda, cult manipulation, and targeted corruption in order to erode their enemies from within. By the time the Legion strikes, their foes have already been weakened by unrest, rebellion, and the whispering, gibbering promises of chaos. Even then, the Alpha Legion prefers that others bleed in their stead. Cultists, mercenaries, and unsuspecting pawns who never realize whose plans they truly serve. Their hallmark maneuver is also known as the harrowing, and it embodies every aspect of this philosophy, as it will be subtly followed by devastation that completely subsumes their enemies, as it begins with uprisings and sabotages, spreading confusion like wildfire. Then comes infiltration, surgically removing a world's command and control structures and replacing it with their own. And finally comes the killing blow, a coordinated, multi-pronged assault of a terrifying precision, one which would leave even the Raven Guard impressed. This is often led by their Terminators and their heavily armored Astartes operatives. The title of Harrow Master itself is one of immense prestige, reserved for those capable of orchestrating such an intricate destruction of their adversaries. Unlike many of their traitor brethren, the Alpha Legion rarely seeks refuge within the Eye of Terror, as they move through real space, avoiding the warp's distortion, allowing their gene seed to be remarkably pure. The question then lies, how can such a massed traitorous force remain active for 10,000 years after the heresy, as according to Inquisitor Craven, the Huntsman, the answer lies within the Imperium itself. The Alpha Legion recruits and augments new operatives from Imperial worlds, training them under the noses of their supposed enemies, at times training them within the structure of a loyalist chapter, not only gaining their knowledge, relics, and tactics, but also decades upon decades of training and connection. Amongst their specialized units are Seeker Squads, Leonin Terminators, and Efreet stealth teams, the latter of which were commanded by Omegon himself, and they would even go so far as to break the Mechanicus' belief structure by developing their own advanced technology in secret, including the first bolter rounds capable of piercing power armor, and even modified variants of Mark VI Corvus pattern power armor, which they would refer to as the Corvus Alpha suit. Then comes one of the things that sets them the most apart from any other Space Marine Legion: their use of chameleon technology, a device capable of altering both armor and flesh, allowing them to physically, quite literally, impersonate anyone, including but not limited to individuals from rival legions to a simple human clerk, and be physically and biologically that which they are impersonating. Because when it comes to the Alpha Legion, the only truth that remains certain is that nothing is ever certain. This is because when dealing with the Alpha Legion, the truth is a rather slippery thing, as every fact is actually closer to a rumor, and every rumor is a question. And when you think you've truly found the real story, the truth behind the fiction, you're only looking at what they wanted you to believe was real. Before the heresy, the Legion's methods were already unconventional and held in rather low regards, as most Space Marine Legions tested their recruits through individual trials of strength, will, and endurance. However, the Alpha Legion operated in a completely different manner. They tested entire squads and their ability to work together. Either the team succeeded as one, or the team failed together, as they believed solo heroics were a liability, not a virtue. And the Alpha Legion prioritized unity and teamwork, not the symbolic kind, but a real, functioning hive of purpose, as every soldier was a cell in a singular, calculating organism. Their very structure reflected that kind of thinking, as traditional ranks like companies and chapters were replaced by harrows, cohorts, hosts, and instruments, all which were designed to be ever-shifting formations that appeared and dissolved, then reformed as the situation demanded. Commanders were called harrow masters, and would only be appointed so long as their theater of war existed. Once a campaign ended, the structure they commanded and even themselves would vanish. Inside their councils, things were surprisingly democratic. Decisions weren't handed down from on high. Instead, everyone, even the Legion's human operatives, could speak freely during the planning sessions, as discussions ranged from strategy to philosophy, and even the implementation of imperial policy. These were topics that would have gotten most men silenced by their superiors elsewhere, even in the more generous legions such as the Blood Angels or the Ultramarines, and yes, that would even include the Salamanders. Later generations of recruits would then be chosen for their sharp minds, initiative, and their ability to question orders intelligently. This was a rarity even amongst the Emperor's Angels of Death. As an aside, they would probably respect Nasir Ahmed for his ability to question even the Emperor's decisions. Even then, their doctrine of identity was strange. To the Alpha Legion, they were a legion in its truest sense. Cut off the head and the body would still strike. When outsiders asked their names, every legionary would give the same answer: I am Alfarius. Even when several stood together, each would claim the same identity, a tactic that was designed to confuse both their allies and to terrify their enemies, as it wasn't just misdirection, it was an ingrained belief. To them, this went so far as to, when the loss of Alfarius occurred, the real one, whoever he was, nothing would truly change within the Legion's operational integrity. Alongside their Astartes operated Stragoti, or snowmen, human operatives who had been embedded within the imperial military and bureaucracy. They were agents who would be hidden in plain sight, like seeds in foreign soil, waiting for the merest hint of the signal to act. The one way to tell them apart was that each bore a small Hydra tattoo in a place that would not normally be observable by most. This would be a silent mark of allegiance. If discovered, these operatives weren't abandoned. The Legion would risk entire missions and campaigns in order to recover or conceal them. And when that wasn't possible, the Alpha Legion had other ways of keeping their secrets buried permanently. After the Horus Heresy, whatever remained of the Legion dissolved into something else entirely. If there was ever a centralized Alpha Legion, that is. It most definitely hasn't existed for a very long time. The Hydra became their symbol, and this symbol became ever so prominent within the Legion, as it was a beast that fights on, no matter how many of its heads you sever. always pulling at multiple directions. And fittingly, the assassination of a supposed Legion commander has never slowed them. Every death simply births another head somewhere else. According to the fragmentary inquisitional records that were gathered by Inquisitor Craven, the modern Alpha Legion operates as countless independent cells scattered across the Imperium, each functioning autonomously, embedded within cults, militias, and even imperial administrations. Destroy one cell, and the others will continue undisturbed, untraceable, and yet somehow, despite all this chaos within their deception, they act with an eerie synchronicity that beguiles even the synchronicity of the ever-secretive Dark Angels. How do they coordinate? Officially, the Imperium has no idea, but rather they posit a simple answer, that they don't. The unofficial answer is far stranger. Some theorize that they maintain communications through their operatives, human intermediaries with specially developed psychohypnotic therapies designed to obey Legion commands in particular ways without hesitation or even memory of doing so. These agents supposedly exist fully within Imperial society, relaying orders and intelligence between these cells. The result is a decentralized intelligence network that functions without any form of visible leadership, or at least leadership that anyone can identify. This is a system that works disturbingly well, which might explain why every attempt by the Inquisition to uproot as much of it as possible ends up in silence or misdirection. It is important to understand that while fractured, the Legion can still unify when the price is worth the risk. If a target is tempting enough or a plan grand enough, multiple warbands will converge on a single Harrowmaster, forming a temporary but devastating coalition. One such example occurred in the darkest days of M42, when Harrowmaster Solomon Akura gathered a number of Alpha Legion splinter cells under one banner. His alliance included forces with names such as the Serpent's Teeth, the Guns of Freedom, the Shrouded Hand, the Penitent Sons, the Faceless, the Sons of Venom, the First Strike, the Rustbloods, and together they nearly destabilized entire sectors of Imperial space. Even in their fractured state, they remain faithful to Alfarius' creed, one that amounts to the fact that every problem has multiple solutions, and every plan should unfold like a Hydra's strike, swift, coordinated, and impossible to stop once begun. The most accomplished of their commanders bear the title of Masters of Division, experts in misdirection, illusion, and deceit above all others. This is the truth about the Alpha Legion to this day, or at least the truth that we are permitted to see, because the moment you think you figured them out, you start to wonder whether that's what they wanted all along, or if you, in fact, are Alfarius. Even amongst the traitors, their story remains one of falsehoods sealed behind 10,000 years of silence. But to gain a better understanding, we must start at the beginning, as the Alpha Legion, also known as the 20th Legion, was one of the Emperor's original 20 created legions, and the Legion itself would be one of the later born in the first founding. And unlike other legions, they were specifically made for subtlety, precision decapitating strikes, and misdirection. The legion was designed not just to win wars, but to make their enemies forget that they lost them in the first place. Their ranks were made to blend within Astartes and mortal operatives by being slightly smaller than the norm. Warriors and infiltrators alike, each piece was made to be a part of an ever-shifting game, all set about the galactic chessboard. Their primarch, or perhaps better stated as primarchs, known as Alfarius and Omegon, together were called Alfarius Omegon, recognized as a singular entity rather than two beings, to the point that not even their brothers knew the truth, that they were two minds acting as one. The irony of this is, after their fight with Rogel Dorn, no one can say which of them lived and which of them died, or whether they even died in the first place, and it was all an illusion, where a lowly legionary took their place against Rogel Dorn during the heresy, allowing Alfarius Omegon to continue to operate behind the scenes. As previously stated, one supposedly fell to Rogel Dorn at Pluto during the Horus Heresy, the other said to have been slain later by Rabut Guilliman. And yet the Alpha Legion operatives have been reported centuries later, fitting the exact descriptions, mannerisms, and even forms of the Primarch, and whispering the name Alfarius in a manner distinct from the traditional "I am Alfarius," leading some within the Inquisition to believe that at least one of their Primarchs still walks amongst them. It is to the point that you might say that the Alpha Legion has a rather unique definition for killed in action. According to imperial records, the Legion was the last to have been reunited with their primarchs, serving for a mere 20 Terran solar cycles, meaning that the Legion was so impacted by their primarch merely a few scant years before the heresy erupted. Yet somehow we are led to believe that their style of warfare became infamous without the guiding principles of a primarch. However, some scant records lead higher ups within the Inquisition to believe that Alfarius was truly the first primarch found, raised by Malcador rather than the Emperor, in secret from the rest of the galaxy, making him the true first son of the Emperor, which would account for their higher than normal mannerisms resembling their primarch than other legions, who were later discovered. And it would explain how their methodology of combat shifted so little despite having discovered their primarch, as this was a rather infamous and identifiable method of warfare. Where other legions fought in glory and spectacle, or for a great moment of victory, the Alpha Legion fought for outcome. They struck from the shadows, dismantling armies before their enemies could even realize they were at war. They infiltrated, corrupted, and redirected entire planetary defense networks without ever revealing their hand. This would set them apart from even the Raven Guard, who, while choosing a similar aesthetic and general ideology for tactics, would indeed often have a large presence. However, their methods, they called this doctrine the long game. The art of war was to them measured not in battles won, but rather in narratives rewritten. They were just as, if not prouder, if a world that would have normally rebelled against the Imperium suddenly found itself as a part of it, never having even fired a single shot, even if it took significantly longer to persuade it subtly to join. However, their methods did not sit well with everyone. During the campaign on Dresda Prime, Alfarius executed a flawless conquest, manipulating, misleading, and dismantling the enemy so completely that the planet's defenders didn't even realize they had actually engaged in any form of combat before it was too late. The price was time and patience, something that even Rabut Guilliman of the Ultramarines found intolerable. He accused Alfarius of wasting resources and delaying victory. Alfarius's only response was the simple statement, "Too easy." In essence, pointing out that Rabut Guilliman's methods, while quick and easy, were rather blunt and unwieldy. And if there's one thing the Alpha Legion has never been accused of, is doing things the easy way. When the heresy itself had begun, their true allegiance became something rather complicated. At Isfahan 5, they arrived as loyalists in the second wave, only to turn their guns upon the Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and the Iron Hands. The massacre that followed was one of the most defining betrayals of the war. Yet beyond that moment, the Alpha Legion records fade into contradiction. Some accounts place them fighting the Space Wolves and the White Scars, while others suggest they were already pursuing their own secretive campaigns independent from Horus's greater rebellion. And even after the fall of the War Master at Terra, the Alpha Legion didn't flee into the Eye of Terror with the others. Instead, they slipped further east, continuing a series of shadow wars, not only against the Ultramarines, but strangely enough, against some fleeing members of Chaos and even Xenos. Their final reported engagement of that era would take place on the world known as Escador, where Guilliman faced Alfarius, or at least who we believe is Alfarius. Knowing the 20th Legion's reputation for psychological warfare, Guilliman deliberately broke from his own codified doctrines, adopting an unpredictable series of reckless tactics. For perhaps the first and only time in history, Alfarius was truly outplayed. Once again, at least who we believe is Alfarius, the two primarchs would meet in battle, and Alfarius was surprisingly easily taken down, and his body burned upon a pyre as Guilliman looked on. But as with all things concerning the Alpha Legion, the story wouldn't end there. Moments after their supposed defeat, the Alpha Legion forces launched a series of counterattacks, precision strikes, and other attacks that necessitated the Ultramarines to be in those exact positions, crippling the Ultramarines' attachments and utterly erasing any illusion of victory, forcing Guilliman to concede the battle, withdrawing his forces and ordering an orbital bombardment to end it once and for all. Yet the Legion, surprisingly enough, still endured, their resources barely touched. As several Imperial scholars have noted, Escador itself seems to have been just another act within the grand misdirection, on a scale that only a primarch like Alpharius could conceive of, leading many to ask, was the primarch of the Alpha Legion truly slain, or is the death of Alpharius merely another layer in a vast deception, so vast that even Guilliman played an unknowing part in, as every time the Imperium has thought it finally struck the death nail, the Alpha Legion just returns from another direction, under another name, but with the same purpose, much like their sigil, the Hydra, as every head falls, is now replaced with two more. Before the treachery of Horus ever stained the stars, the 20th Legion was already a secret the galaxy wasn't meant to find. Before the Horus heresy, before the fires of brotherhood and betrayal, there was the Ghost Legion, the 20th. Its formation, purpose, and even existence were intentionally cloaked by the Emperor in layers of imperial secrecy so dense that even the Emperor's own court couldn't see through them. This was in no small part, supposedly because of Malgador the Sigillite's own actions. However, some believe that it was the Emperor's design all along, a deliberate and intentional act of concealment. Many imperial historians now whisper that this veil of secrecy wasn't just a measure of protection, but rather the seeds of something darker. What had begun as prudence curdled into obsession, a legion bred for deception and infiltration, for subterfuge, and perhaps in time, to be both consumed and to consume all around them with those very talents. Once they were the Emperor's sharpest hidden blade, a veritable scalpel, but as Horus rose as a war master, that blade began to twist even in the wielder's hand. The Alpha Legion became something serpentine, a hydra both in form and function, its very identity splintered, its purpose devouring not only its enemies but itself, as they became a weapon that had no hand, one that not even the very gods of the Imperium could deign to control. Even the circumstances of their creation remains disputed, as the 20th Legion was amongst the last to be crafted in the gene laboratories beneath Terra's ash-choked skies in the very twilight days of the Unification Wars. While all legions were born under layers of secrecy, the 20th was enveloped in an extraordinary yet suspicious silence, a silence that even the Emperor's closest advisors were forbidden to question. This is to the point that they were grouped with the Salamanders and the Space Wolves, proto-legions, and even there the 20th was raised apart from its brothers. Each of these three was forged for a purpose, one which was rather specific and delicate that if exposed to the greater Imperium, it might jeopardize the great work itself. But while the Salamanders would emerge on the Paragon side of the spectrum, and the Space Wolves would be the loyal lapdogs of the Emperor, the 20th grew even more distant, less trusted than any of its kin. Where their peers marched to glory, the 20th became ghosts. Their early records are little more than scattered reports and redacted entries, sparse, suggestive, and overall deeply unsettling. There are mentions, just mentions, of unknown Astartes detachments carrying out surgical strikes on high-priority targets, abductions, assassinations, eliminations so clean that it is almost as if they never happened, and if not within these records, there would be no knowledge of them. These operations bore authorization seals from the highest levels, codes that brokered no challenge, even from other Imperial commanders, even from primarchs. And then there's the matter of the ever so suspicious name, Alpha, which is a simple designation, but one that carried a strange amount of weight. The name itself was actually derived from the final stage of Gene Seed testing and the first deployment of Legion that was no longer in the experimental stages. Yet publicly the Alpha Legion and their use of Alpha was meant for being ready for war. Yet its hidden meaning and the reasons behind it were lost to time, as it seems the 20th Legion never proceeded past that phase. Each Legion undergoing the Alpha stages of Gene Seed testing underwent small staged inductions using rather restricted test groups in order to prepare for full-scale development. When the Alpha stage was reached, the Emperor would typically authorize mass recruitment, expanding the Proto-Legion into a full fighting force, but not with the 20th Legion. Records show that after their field tests, which by all surviving accounts were exemplary, beyond even the expectations held for the other legions, they were never approved for expansion. No recruitment zones, no Terran intake, no mass growth. The 20th Legion Legion was restricted to remain as a compact force, perhaps only a few thousand strong, while other legions became armadas of tens of thousands of Astartes. This was a deliberate isolation, but the question remains for many in the Imperium unanswered as why. Now, theories are rather numerous, as they have always been with anything that involves the Alpha Legion. The first is rather mundane: sabotage, as supposedly their recruitment network are believed to have been compromised for some reason, be it the best genetic stock had been already claimed by other legions. However, that quickly falls apart when viewing legions such as the Ninth, the Revenant Legion, who would even adopt near abhuman, things that were so genetically far from humanity that under the presence of any other legion, they would have been purged. Then there's others who posit perhaps some forgotten catastrophe forced the Emperor's hand, wiping out their intake sources entirely, something similar to what occurred with the Emperor's children. However, there are other theories, ones whispered amongst fewer scholars, suggesting that there is a hidden flaw, something within the gene seed or in the men themselves. Yet this is difficult to reconcile with the data, as the 20th success rates were superlative, cleaner than even the Dark Angels and the Ultramarines gene lines, to the point that it makes the aberrations and the ability to implement the Canis Helix of the Space Wolves come into question if that was the issue. Then there is another line of speculation, one which is rather chilling, that the Emperor created them in this way with a deliberate containment in mind. This theory posits that the Emperor wanted the 20th to be held apart, perhaps as a reserve of untainted genetic material, perhaps a control group, or even, as some custodians' personal archives suggest, as a testbed for something greater. There's even a handful of cryptic data fragments that hint that the Alpha Legion may have been a stepping stone towards the creation of the Grey Knights, or some similar hidden faction. That is, if we are to believe that the Grey Knights were intended to be created all along. By the year 798 M30, the Great Crusade had already been in full motion, when the Legion's gene-forged sons had set about across the vast stars in grand expeditionary fleets, binding the shattered fragments of humanity beneath the Imperial Aquila. Yet amidst the thunder of conquest and the blaze of triumph, one Legion, the 20th, for a while, simply vanished. For solar decades, their name utterly disappeared from record. Scores and scores of Imperial data slates did not even recognize their existence. Yet, there is no trace of them being destroyed or disbanded. Simply, they ceased to be within the record. Much like Enoch, they were not. Still, the void that they left behind would not remain silent. As whispers traced their shadows through the darkest corners of the Crusade, their operations seemingly so classified that even the throne of Terra itself seemed to be fully unsure of who had given the orders, be it Malcador the Sigillite or the Emperor himself. Some within the uppermost echelons of the Imperium began to suspect that the 20th Legion, still leaderless and bereft of their primarch, had been assigned a completely hidden purpose, their mission buried even beneath the Emperor's own bureaucracy. The running theory goes as follows. While the Great Crusade sought to unite humanity against the alien horrors and the ancient nightmares that had brought them down during the Age of Strife, the Emperor also feared an enemy within. And indeed, that danger was real, as insurrections, rebellions, along with the return of defeated warlords who once bled the soul of Terra dry, now feasted in the newborn Imperium's heart. Many of these figures, twisted by ambition or warped by contact with the immaterial, sought to twist the imperial truth itself into a weapon against its creator. Then came what some scholars call the incident, a silent crisis that reached the very genetic vaults of the Legion's Astartes, a corruption that almost destroyed the Third Legion permanently, those who would become the future Emperor's children. That event, dated roughly at 838 M30, was truly catastrophic, as their gene seed was tainted by an unidentified viral blight, nearly eradicating their line before it could truly begin. But alongside that disaster came strange reports, scattered accounts of Astartes detachments operating exceedingly far away from any known front, executing surgical strikes and assassinations, all without identifiable heraldry, records, or even recognition from Terra. They fought like Space Marines, they moved like Space Marines, but they bore no Legion markings, and they had no support vessels that could be recognized. Or worse, they bore and used the wrong ones, in combinations that did not make sense. In some instances, mysterious warriors appeared wearing the established colors and heraldry of legions such as the Iron Hands, the Luna Wolves, even the Ultramarines, only for the genuine articles to later discover that they had never sanctioned such deployments. These false flag operations seemed to function with a level of precision and care that left no witnesses and only scattered data fragments to bring about the truth. Everything from assassinations, data theft, sabotage, abduction of planetary officials, the recovery of artifacts of interest that were directly then stored within the vaults of Terra, all carried out by these faceless Astartes who vanished before reinforcements could ever arrive. Amongst the whispers that circulated the High Imperial Command, a name began to circulate for this faction. They would become known as the Ghost Legion. Publicly, no such force existed. Unofficially, that depends on who you ask, and whether you believe anything involving the Alpha Legion. Reports of the Ghost Legion were rare, or at least those that surfaced were rare. Governors who lodged formal protests saw their petitions vanish in administrative black holes. Officers who questioned these incursions found their orders quickly amended. And even more, the Legio Custodes, the Officio Assassinorum, and the Securitas Incancius rose to prominence, and the more prominent they became, the more the Ghost Legion faded into imperial myth. If the Ghost Legion ever truly coherently existed, and that is a big if, it represented a terrifying possibility. A legion of the Emperor's own superhuman creation, whose specialty was to act outside the laws of even the Emperor himself, within the shadows and outside the expectations of others. A legion that operated truly unseen, one that to be understood needed to have an individual look underneath the underneath. However, this was a question no one dared truly ask the Emperor. For over a century, it seems, the 20th Legion may have waged its own wars in the shadows, behind not just enemy lines, but the lines of the Imperium itself. A silent campaign fought beneath the noise of the Great Crusade, gathering knowledge, experience, and influence unseen by their brother legions. What became of them in those years, what they learned, remains a mystery, tangled in a web of lies, or perhaps more accurately, an unknowable conundrum, wrapped in an enigma. And with their reappearance, the question comes to mind. Did their purpose simply reach its conclusion, or were they superseded by new imperial intelligence organizations? Or had they grown too independent, too unpredictable, and too dangerous to be tolerated in such a manner any longer? Some scholars suggest that the Legion's time in the shadows only truly ended when their long-lost primarch was finally discovered, at least officially. Others say they were never brought to heel at all. Whatever the truth, assuming the word truth applies here, the Legion stepped out of the dark and bore a new name, one that would come to haunt imperial history, the Alpha Legion. By the late 880s of the 30th millennium, the Imperium was bleeding across thousands of fronts, but nowhere more severely than in the Rangdang Xenocide. These wars waged against an alien menace so vile that entire systems were quarantined from imperial memory, threatened to unravel the Great Crusade itself. It was during the third Xenocide, amidst the smoldering ruins of the Northern Imperium, that a figure stepped from the shadows and presented himself before Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels. He claimed to be Alfarius. The man, or Astartes, depending on his stature, admitted that he himself was a Primarch of the 20th Legion, and he offered his assistance against the Rangdang nonetheless. The man, when questioned by Lionel Johnson, would be told that the Primarch of the 20th Legion had not been found yet. However, Alfarius, or the individual formally calling himself Alfarius, offered the Lion assistance against the Rangdang nonetheless, at one point even claiming that the 20th Legion favored Johnson as the future War Master of the Imperium. This would be a curious title that at the time did not yet fully exist, leading to speculation of this story being true or false, bringing about the question, why would this so-called Alfarius speak of a rank that had not been yet created? Why would the 20th Legion, unknown even to their brother legions, court a Primarch that they had never served under? Some suggest that this was a calculated overture, that the Primarch of the 20th was never found, or that it was a legion made with no Primarch in mind, and this was merely an Astartes playing the role for its legion. Others suggest this was a test to see which of the Emperor's sons would bend first to flattery, while others posit that it might have been a message meant for someone else entirely. Whatever the case, the lion listened. Whether he accepted the offer was another matter entirely, as the Dark Angels would triumph against the Rangdang soon after this meeting, but at a cost that would nearly destroy him. Over 50,000 Battle Brothers were slain. However, the Rangdang were eradicated, yet the whispers of the 20th's involvement in this campaign persisted. If true, the victory might have been less of a triumph of the Lion's will and more of a demonstration of the Alpha Legion's first game in this galactic stage. Now the first official records of the Alpha Legion's emergence as a recognized force are predictably contradictory, where some Imperial archives date their debut preceding the Frontius extermination. Others pick the darkest day of the third Rangdang Xenocide. This discrepancy is one of around 30 years, and it would make them the last legion to be formally acknowledged by the Emperor's war machine. Even their name seems to be a joke, potentially poking fun of the Dark Angels. The Alpha Legion, meaning first, supreme, primary. Said name could be seen as biting their thumb at the Dark Angels' claim to be the first legion. However, what is known is that they were the final legion to be recognized, and perhaps the last to be understood. Their chosen symbol, even during this, was the Hydra, which embodied multiplicity, deception, and regeneration, much like what they would profess their tactics to be, where they would act like a serpent coiled through the sacred geometries of the pre-imperial mechanism. Then of course comes Alpharius himself, the least known primarch, if indeed he ever existed as a man, rather than an Astartes playing the role, seems to have few sources covering him. Reliable sources, which the Alpha Legion has made certain there are precious few, present multiple irreconcilable stories of his discovery. One tale circulated within the Imperial court tells of a Luna Wolves battleship ambushed in an obscure system by a coalition of human worlds led by a cunning warlord. Horus, enraged by such a loss, pressured the enemy into a grueling gauntlet of traps until the supposed warlord infiltrated the vengeful spirit itself, cutting down the majority of Horus's Justarian Terminator elite before confronting the Primarch and eventual War Master directly. But rather than striking the killing blow, Horus recognized him as if by some buried instinct and declared him brother. The warlord would reveal himself to be Alpharius. Another account, extracted under psychic duress from a captured Alpha Legion centurion, claims that Alpharius was found on a nameless dead world amidst the Middragon stars, raised alone amongst the ruins, haunted by spectral predators. When Xenos corsairs arrived to plunder the world, the young Primarch slew them and took their vessel to seek his creator. Yet another version exists, sourced from the heretical text known as the Codex Hydra, spins an entirely different tale, one that states that Alpharius was a captive of the Xenos known as the Slough, and twisted into a living weapon until the Emperor himself stormed the fortress and freed his son. The final and rarer account, yet the most detailed one, seems stranger still. It states that Alpharius was never scattered at all, but rather grew beneath the Emperor's own watch under the direct guiding hand of Malcador the Sigillite, and he was to act as a hidden guardian and assassin kept in the shadows to safeguard his great work. Each story seemingly contradicts the others. Each insists upon its own authenticity, and yet each could be false or true, or even both, because with the Alpha Legion, the distinction between the truth and a falsehood was never the point. Following the Rangdang campaigns, the 20th Legion appeared intermittently in the records of the Great Crusade, often as allies of convenience, though perhaps the word ally is too generous for them. During the castigation of Trentus, a rogue imperial overlord turned against the Emperor after decades of loyal service. There, the Luna Wolves had led the assault alongside elements of the Night Lords, Iron Hands, and an unnamed contingent of Astartes, believed to be, but never confirmed, to have been the Alpha Legion. When Horus slew Trenturus aboard his flagship, the rebellion collapsed, and the skull of the traitor was sent to Terra in mockery. Whether the Alpha Legion presence was ever sanctioned or even real remains unclear. Perhaps they were simply sent there to observe or to ensure that Trenturus fell exactly at the right moment. Then there was the Surreptitious Purgation of 927 M30, a campaign against a Xeno strain said to have existed across dimensions. Records of the event itself are conspicuously absent, apparently intentionally erased. The only surviving notion mentions a sub-company of the 20th Legion being dispatched to investigate investigate these Xenos. However, all communications from the affected colonies ceased shortly thereafter. Whether they were silenced by these extra-dimensional Xenos or the Alpha Legion themselves remains an open question, one which is under beyond top-secret classification indefinitely. When Alpharius was officially presented before the Emperor, the reunion, such as it was, lacked the warmth between a father and son. The records from Terra suggest that while their meeting was celebrated with all the grandeur and ceremony the Imperium could muster, the true interaction between the two was distant, formal, even businesslike, almost as if the Emperor had long interacted with Alpharius. However, others suggest that instead of this, the Emperor, having only one master, priorities, at that time had an entire galaxy to govern and a crusade to lead, leaving little time for sentiment. Alpharius, for his part, seemed to understand. What little time they shared together remains mostly left to speculation. Some within the Legion later whispered that there was more to this reunion than meets the eye, that Alpharius was not one, but two, and that he had already fought the Emperor's shadow, Constantine Valdor, years before this. Indeed, those who have studied the 20th Legion closely, or claim to, often spoke of the names Alpharius and Omegon, twin primarchs, so alike even the Emperor's sight was said to have blurred between them. Whether this was a deliberate creation or some anomaly of fate, potentially even a primarch ability, which all are said to have at least one, none can be sure of. It seems the two of them acted as one mind split between two physical forms, a shared soul divided by the needs of strategy. To the outside world, there was only Alpharius. Omegon remained in the shadows, an echo behind the voice, even to their siblings. The Emperor, it seems, was aware of this truth and chose silence, even during the heresy. After all, when one's goals are as vast as uniting the stars, a secret or two must be considered a rather useful weapon. Only the Alpha Legion knew of this duality, and they guarded this information as fiercely as any fortress or fortification. Under their twin command, the Legion took form, becoming a reflection of their Primarch, as sharp, analytical, and impossibly disciplined as their gene sire. They fought not for glory, but for results. Every operation was executed with impeccable precision and terrifying unity. To the Alpha Legion, individuality was secondary to the mission. The whole was a weapon, not the man. And in battle, they were a sight to behold. Their coordination bordered on the preternatural, squads moving as though they were guided by a singular will, their assault unfolding with a cold inevitability. But even as they fought alongside their brother legions, they kept a measured distance. The Alpha Legion smiled little, joked less, and revealed nothing to their allies, to the point that many of them found it utterly disquieting, unnerving even, as if fighting beside a reflection that could vanish the moment you blink. A living mirage, if you will. Some wondered if beneath this efficiency there lied something else. Contempt, perhaps, or a quiet amusement at how easily others believed what they were meant to see. The next well-recorded event involving the Alpha Legion, and amongst the earliest of the verifiable campaigns, lies with the Xenocide of the Akahera. This was a race of Xenos known to frontier colonists by a far more gruesome name. These were the Bone Drinkers, parasitic organisms that lived in conjoined masses of gestalt fungal flesh, forming a sentient mass that fed upon the marrow of living prey, and they seemed to prefer humans above all else. Initially believed to have been wiped out by the Lone Wolves during earlier crusade operations, the Ahamkara returned decades later, preying upon isolated worlds in the western segmentum solar. When word reached Terra that an old horror had stirred once more, it was Alpharius that answered the call. The campaign that followed was a study in methodical eradication. The Alpha Legion divided its fleet into smaller hunter-killer wings, each moving with eerie precision without direct communication through the void to corner the fleeing swarms. They anticipated every migration pattern, every attempt at concealment. Where the Ahamkara infested abandoned space hulks, the Legion descended in silent boarding actions. Where they found nests buried with human colonists, they unleashed orbital fire until the air itself burned into inexistence. But what made the campaign infamous wasn't the ruthlessness of the Alpha Legion, but rather their cunning. Alpharius uncovered that many of these hidden nests survived through human collaboration. Cults and governors who had betrayed safety in exchange for the blood of their subjects. Rather than purge these traitors outright, the Alpha Legion used them, infiltrated their very network, and fed them misinformation, luring the largest marrow blooms into carefully orchestrated traps. When the killing was done, some of those collaborators met their end by the sword, by toxin, or by a gentle nudge of their planet's tectonic plate. When victory was all but secured, Alpharius chose to end the war in the only way he could. Working with the Magos biologists of the Mechanicum, the Legion engineered a phage, a viral poison that was harmless to most humans, but utterly lethal, and tailored perfectly to the Ahankura's biology, in a way that no adaptation and no change, other than a key aberration that would essentially label them as a completely different species, down to the last molecule, could overcome. The Legion released it upon the very worlds the Xenos had once fed from, ensuring that any surviving bone drinker would perish the next time it fed. The cost, well, that was generations of humans carrying the dormant strain, their bodies turned into silent weapons without their consent. Alpharius had, in effect, poisoned the Ahankuran's food supply, infecting mankind itself, while not necessarily directly striking out. This was cold, effective, and unsettlingly poetic. There are other records of their activity, but these have far less information. These include the compliance of 529, where details remain scarce, but surviving accounts describe the Alpha Legion's campaign against an unknown foe designated 529. Records would later be sealed or destroyed, though whether this was by bureaucratic order or by the Legion's own hand remains but merely a guess. Then there was the compliance of World, conducted alongside the Geno 760th Sparkoid, which was known to be one of the finest regiments of Imperial Army and hardened veterans by any standard. It seems that their activities upon this world were unsettling to even these legendary human veterans, even their Astartes allies, claiming that the Alpha Legion seemed to already know the outcome of every engagement and every move made by their adversaries. There is also the compliance of Thorium Abompex, a joint operation between the Death Guard and the Alpha Legion, and it is notable for no surviving record other than records stating that it occurred, surviving, and claims of biomes within the area of this engagement, for some reason, being erased rather than conquered, due to inconsistencies between galactic maps before this incident and afterward. In every campaign, one thing would remain consistent. It was the ability of the Alpha Legion to turn itself into a riddle, with each victory only raising more questions. Who gave the order? Who had truly guided the hand that struck? And of course, what at the time would be considered the Legion's motto, one which was whispered by those who encountered them: there is no Alpha Legion. Deeper into the mysteries revolving the Alpha Legion, we not only find that there were no cultures whose genetics could be traced back to old Terra within the Legion itself. As it seems, it materialized fully formed, with no recruitment logs, no training records, just there. Tens of thousands of perfectly equipped legionaries, and a fleet that moved like they had been veterans of 100 campaigns. Imperial logistics couldn't even confirm what color they actually wore, much less where they came from. Some reports at times would list them as being a shimmering blue-green, while another would report them as black. One quartermaster would famously state, "It was as if the 20th Legion appeared whole cloth, already seasoned and quite determined to ignore any attempt to account for it." Even their name wasn't consistent. While Alpha Legion eventually stuck within Imperial records, field reports show them calling themselves the Unbroken Chain, the Coiled Hydra, and most ominously, the Harrowing, a title they used during the Predefiction Gap exterminations, and more fittingly, whenever one of their warriors spoke, they always seemed to share the name Alpharius. To outsiders, it was quite maddening. However, to the Alpha Legion, it was a sign of unity, maybe even misdirection. Hard to say which, due to the circles within circles mentality that defines the Alpha Legion. Some after-action records suggest a darker reason behind their strange behavior. During one particular campaign, alongside the Clarakash Auxilia against the Crave at Memlock, analysts discovered something unsettling. Code names used by the Alpha Legion operatives exactly matched the names of citizens from a world a legion had previously exterminated. Whether this was a coincidence or some form of dark humor remains largely debated. Still, it seems the Emperor tolerated their tactics and gave them more leeway than most of his other legions, as did Horus. When he became War Master, it seems he understood that they both knew the value of a blade that could cut quietly, even if no one could entirely be sure of who was wielding the blade. In combat, the Alpha Legion was a study in contrast. Their strategies combined surgical precision strikes with ruthless excess. They were a veritable masterpiece of planning, followed by actions of shocking cruelty, espionage, infiltration, sabotage. They wielded these tools unmatched within the Imperium. Only the Raven Guard could rival them in stealth or subterfuge. But while the Raven Guard fought to minimize suffering, the Alpha Legion seemed to almost enjoy the chaos they caused. They didn't just want to defeat their enemies in glorious combat. They wanted to dismantle them slowly, psychologically, as entire civilizations would be turned against themselves before a single shot was fired. By the time the Alpha Legion would strike, their victims were already broken, and their armies a tangled mess of fear and confusion. And then would come the harrowing. This would be less of a battle and more of a dissection, a synchronized assault from 100 different directions at once. Drop pods, strike cruisers, and Alpha Legion agents appearing without warning. Ground assaults coordinated with pinpoint orbital strikes preceding them. Each attack precisely calibrated to exploit confusion, which had already been strewn in the weeks prior. Even months at times, if the enemy took longer to take down. To many of the other legions, this wasn't war, it wasn't noble, it was murder, efficient and absolute. Despicable to some, praiseworthy to others. To their enemies, they were nightmares made flesh, a force that could be anywhere, anyone, everyone, and no one at once. To their allies, they were an uneasy presence, too clever, too quiet, too interested in why everyone else was fighting, as if they were testing the answers. Officially, the Alpha Legion burned bright but briefly during the Great Crusade. Yet for all their victories and all the blood they spilled, they were never truly trusted or truly seen as true compatriots. So, in turn, they studied other legions, copied their tactics, adapted them in ways that made even the Ultramarines uneasy. Guilliman himself once dismissed them as students who learned all the wrong lessons. But if there's one thing Imperial history teaches any of us, it is that with the Alpha Legion, the truth is a lie and everything is permitted, as nothing will ever be certain. Because even now, 10,000 years after the heresy, there are still whispers, fleeting reports of coordinated strikes, sabotage operations, and unknown fleets moving in perfect, silent synchronicity. At times, these agents, in fact, do seem to help the Imperium's overall goals. At others, they destabilize entire sectors. As the final years before the heresy come to a close, whispers had begun to circle around the 20th Legion. Whispers that the Hydra was turning inwards, perhaps simply revealing what it has always been, or as some others posit, they might have even been given a secret task by the Emperor. The Alpha Legion's brilliance had never once been questioned, but neither had its secrecy. That combination over time became a dangerous thing. As their victories grew, so did suspicion amongst their peers. Other legions began to murmur. Could they trust a force that never fought the same way twice, that seemed to keep its true strength hidden even from its allies? Conflicts followed. Alpharius' manner was cold, calculating, and often irreverent. This made enemies of more than one of his brothers. Guilliman of the Ultramarines and Mortarion of the Death Guard both openly clashed with him on multiple occasions. Their disputes recorded during the aftermath of the Ulnor Triumph and the Vasilis Uprising. Even Rogel Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, never once to mince words, branded Alpharius and his Alpha Legion as honorless assassins unfit to bear the Emperor's mark. This insult nearly drew bloodshed between their officers, a duel of honor that only the Emperor's direct intervention prevented. This occurred following the fall of Fortress Drocla during the Alvaron Compliance, and Dorn wasn't alone in his open contempt. Conrad Kurz, the pathetic primarch of the Night Lords, hardly a paragon of moral virtue himself, would often accuse the 20th Legion of hiding their sins in the shroud of lies. The Thousand Sons themselves were always wary of any truth or knowledge hidden from them, leading to Magnus's sons avoiding the 20th entirely whenever possible. No one learned precisely why they were so openly averse to them, as opposed to other secrets that the Thousand Sons could hope not avoid. Perhaps this was one of the few times they believed it was better not to look too closely. Yet for all the friction, the Alpha Legion wasn't entirely without friends. Horus Lupercal, the War Master-to-be, saw something in them that he considered valuable. To him, the Alpha Legion was a scalpel where others were hammers. Their methods brutal, efficient, but clean in regards to the Legion itself. He would even go so far as to call Alpharius a kindred spirit. However believable that is, since similar honeyed words is how he seduced Mortarion into joining the traitors, as he saw Alpharius and his legion as a weapon of precision in an age of grand slaughter. Under Horus's command, the Alpha Legion would thrive, gaining freedoms no other legion enjoyed. It must also be noted that they fought beside the Dark Angels and the Iron Hands without incident. This was a rarity to say the least, as these two were viewed as some of the more abrasive legions to work with. And the Alpha Legion was noted as masters of integrating mortal forces and combined arms tactics into their repertoire, using them as pieces in their vast, unseen equations of war, coldly and efficiently, without regard for how many pieces they left behind on the board, at least to an imperial historiator's perspective. However, it is important to note that despite all this negativity surrounding them, results spoke for themselves. No other legion was as effective in rooting out rebellion, unmasking treachery, or erasing Xenos threats that had slipped between the cracks of the Great Crusade. They became the Emperor's veritable shadow, one sent to deal with problems too dangerous or too subtle for the rest of their kin. But shadows have a way of growing darker, growing longer, unrestrained. When Horus ascended to the rank of War Master, he would go on to give Alpharius near total autonomy. The 20th Legion would then fracture into countless fleets, supposedly operating independently, often fighting alongside or interacting directly with rogue traitors, pushing far beyond the Imperium's borders. At first, it seemed a perfect use for their unique talents, and a way to keep them away from the brothers who held no small amount of animosity towards them. But over time, patterns changed. Reports, fragmented and redacted, began to reach both Terra and the Vengeful Spirit. Even Horus, by then one of, if not the single most powerful man in the galaxy, began to question if he truly commanded the Alpha Legion, or if they had simply convinced him that he did. The tone of their campaigns had shifted. Some Imperial observers noted that the Legion appeared to choose conflicts not for their strategic value, but for sport, as if the complexity of the hunt was what mattered itself more than the victory. However, some observers from within the Alpha Legion would note that it appeared as though the Alpha Legion had one prerogative: maintain humanity's momentum. To which end, that is unknown, but it seemed the Alpha Legion was almost obsessed from keeping the mathematics of humanity stagnant. There always had to be conflict, always change. Movement was necessary. Movement was life. The rest did not seem to matter. The most infamous case occurred on Tresta Prime. Rather than swiftly capturing the capital and ending the war, Alpharius ordered the defenders to be allowed to dig in. The Alpha Legion orchestrated a nightmare of sabotage, misinformation, ambushes, where the enemy's own weapons were turned against them. 90% of the casualties occurred before the inevitable surrender. But strangely enough, those who were left behind seemed to be far more skilled and talented than the rest. When the question of why they hadn't taken a simpler path, Alpharius only answered, because it would have been too easy. Yemen's response was sharp as expected. In a formal protest to Horus directly, he condemned the operation as a wasteful exercise in cruelty and a mockery of the Great Crusade's purpose. From that day, the Ultramarines and the Alpha Legions would never fight alongside each other again. And still, the Hydra kept winning. Its victories mounted, even as its methods grew darker and more obsessive. But amongst the Imperial Court, a belief would begin to spread that the Alpha Legion had become addicted to destruction, that they no longer sought compliance, but the perfect path to perfect subversion, to reduce worlds not to obedience, but to chaos, ruin, as a means to prove their own superiority. Some within the Imperial Court called it arrogance, others pathology. The War Master dismissed this as merely a rumor. Perhaps he even enjoyed the thought of a legion that defied easy understanding. But in truth, well, with the Alpha Legion, it may be simpler, it may be something far simpler, or so complicated that it is functionally simpler not to understand. As the heresy neared, the Alpha Legion functionally vanished into the dark frontier, splitting its fleets once again, changing names, erasing trails. The Imperium lost track of them, if they ever actually had track of them at all. And in that darkness, they multiplied. Each report contradicted the next. Each identity dissolved into another. No one knew what they were doing. No one knew who they truly served, and perhaps neither did they. But to better understand the mistrust and animosity surrounding the Alpha Legion, we must take a closer look into the many campaigns that bred such a reputation. Starting on Tresta Prime, a world whose fate illustrated both the genius and, well, creative cruelty of the 20th Legion. Tresta was a world bound in an iron alliance of totalitarian colonies known as the Conservation, and had survived the Age of Strife through rigid eugenic control, fortitude, and the fortunate happenstance of isolation. Their society was a lattice of caste and obligation, each citizen enslaved to the needs of their civilization. And for the Imperium, each civilization and each citizen was a potential liberation and conversion waiting to happen. When Imperial envoys arrived, they were met with gunfire. The Conservation's worlds had prepared for defense, and in response, the War Master Horus diverted 2 expeditionary fleets, one commanded by Reboot Guilliman and the other by Alpharius. Guilliman immediately struck at the Outer Worlds, constricting the Conservation's military as if his forces were a tightening noose. Alpharius, by contrast, Alpharius circled, probed, created raids, caused disappearances, and led phantom strikes, seemingly at random, but always surgical. Guilliman, growing increasingly frustrated, openly berated Alpharius in council. His argument was simple: emulate the Ultramarines' efficiency, and the Conservation could be brought to heel within mere solar months. However, Alpharius ignored him. Instead, the 20th Legion employed the tactics that they had honed since their earliest campaigns as the Ghost Legion: infiltration, intelligence gathering, the subtle orchestration of chaotic disarray. To the Trestans, the Alpha Legion seemed to flit like shadows on the periphery of existence, threatening but never committing. This provoked strategic errors, as the Conversation committed more troops to the wrong places, leaving the very capital of this conglomerate vulnerable and supply lines dangerously exposed. When the assault finally struck, it was from every direction, all at once. Sabotage tore through Tresta Prime's infrastructure. Strike forces appeared in the heart of the capital, and the defenders were caught in a web of traps so complex and so Machiavellian that it would make a chess master weep. Bridges exploded as divisions tried to redeploy. Communications were intercepted, altered, or obliterated. Orders failed to reach the front lines. The harrowing of Tresta Prime, as chronicles would call it, was total and absolute. Super heavy armored columns of the 20th Legion moved with a mechanical, almost automaton-like precision, striking where the enemy was already weakened, leaving naught but devastation in their wake. The world's regime and infrastructure collapsed. Riots, fires, famine, and disease swept through the streets. Of the planet's nearly 11 billion inhabitants, an estimated 90% would perish in the infighting or in the aftermath of the Alpha Legion strike, leading the capital to capitulate within days. Guilliman formally protested against Alpharius' tactics directly to Horus, calling them dishonorable and untrustworthy of an Astartes. Horus, ever the intelligent strategist, praised Alpharius' execution as masterful, since it led to Alpharius' own forces suffering almost no casualties. To Guilliman, this was a slap to the face, leaving to Guilliman and Alpharius never serving alongside one another during the rest of the Great Crusade. After this campaign, the Alpha Legion's trace would vanish into the outer dark, leaving only speculation and ruin behind. We must next move to the final campaigns of the Imperial Fist, which were led directly by Rogal Dorn. This would be on the unmanned hive world governed by a stubborn ruler known as the World Prince. Initially, Dorn's forces fought methodically, hive by hive, slowly dismantling any resistance. But then, unexpectedly, the Alpha Legion arrived. They claimed to be allies, though no member was seen directly by Dorn's force, and yet the evidence of their presence was unmistakable. Uprisings occurred, coups ignited, and the planet descended into anarchy faster than Dorn's sons could fortify. Over 400 nobles would be executed in rapid succession, and the World Prince would quickly surrender. Dorn confronted Alpharius directly, enraged at the Alpha Legion's underhanded methods, despite their effectiveness. He ordered them to cease all operations and depart, detailing with meticulous precision every flaw in their campaign before leaving, all but muttering in disgust at what he had considered a disreputable approach to war. The next campaign, that brought no small amount of ill repute to the Legion, will take us to the desert world of Nurth, a lost colony discovered in the final years of the Great Crusade by the 670th Expeditionary Fleet, under Lord Commander Denga Nijamastra. Nurth, a planet of harsh, unyielding deserts, had rejected the light of the imperial truth, preferring instead the rigid hierarchies of its pre-industrial society. Attempts to negotiate were only met with gunfire, leaving the imperial army with no choice but a full compliance operation. Primarch Alfarius and elements of the 20th Legion, or at least what is believed to be elements of the 20th Legion, and depending who you asked, no elements of the 20th Legion, joined the Expeditionary Fleet, and though they were never formally incorporated into its order of battle, the Expeditionary Fleet's leader retained nominal command as always. However, whenever Alfarius was present, the Primarch's will was effectively directing the campaign. North itself, at first glance, was a standard desert world, yet upon closer inspection, one would note rather revealing anomalies, hinting at a history far older than what was believed initially. The harbor of Mondo, for example, appeared natural, but only to the untrained eye, as it was actually an artificial construction, the remnants of a way station built by the Xenos Cabal over 11 millennia prior. Similarly, the town known as Telkat, also known as Visages, was surrounded by plains dotted with weathered sculptures of human heads ranging from the size of a pebble to large boulders. Their purpose lost to time. The planet's stark red and orange sands under a painstakingly beautiful, piercing blue sky made glare protection essential to survival on the world, which made it even more difficult for the natives of the planet to notice what was around them. As the campaign progressed, the Nurinth themselves delivered the planet's death blow. Facing an imminent defeat, the chaos-tainted Evereth activated a black cube. This was an ancient weapon of planetary devastation. Within days, it transformed the world's climate into a lethal furnace of noxious winds and infinitely scaling temperatures, scorching the soil, boiling the oceans, and leaving the world utterly lifeless. However, we cannot be certain that it was not in fact the Alpha Legion's doing, since after this they would mysteriously vanish. Next we must turn our sights to the Kaivas Veld, where scattered orc tribes, battered and leaderless after the Ulnar Crusade, had regrouped to harass nearby human systems. The Alpha Legion tracked them down, petitioning Horus for reinforcements. The Luna Wolves, still reeling from prior engagements, declined. However, the ever-noble Blood Angels under Sanguinius would step forward. Alfarius promised a 5-year campaign. However, Sanguinius, ever the optimist, insisted it would be done in one. It seems his gift of foresight was correct, at least in large part. The campaign itself unfolded as a deadly game of cat and mouse. Orc fleets fled the belt, chased by the Alpha Legion in successive waves, only to encounter waiting Blood Angels who chased them down relentlessly, as if they were sharks who had smelled blood in the water, chasing them down through dense asteroid fields, engaging in ship-to-ship combat which would stretch across weeks. This was a veritable grueling ballet of lancefire and torpedo blasts. Yet in the background of the system, the 20th Legion's Expeditionary Fleet moved, generally unseen, guiding the orcs into a trap, with only sporadic communiques instructing the Blood Angels where to maintain the line. Eventually, the Blood Angels dared probe deeper, seeking signs of their allies, not due to mistrust but rather worry. However, what they would find would be nothing but wreckage, orc vessels shattered, alien crews utterly annihilated. Hundreds of Alpha Legion warships had seemingly operated in complete secrecy, hurting the enemy with the precision and control of a sheephound before vanishing without a trace. By the campaign's conclusion, the last orc remnants in the sector would be completely extinguished, and the 20th Legion claimed full responsibility for exterminating the biological infestation. Yet, true to form, their methods would remain largely obscure, but it would guarantee that any spores or remnants of the orcs would vanish in their entirety. However, this is one of the few situations where, despite from the outside seeming mistrustful, the relation between the 9th and the 20th would remain one of the more cordial relationships the Alpha Legion would ever have. With this understanding, it may be easier to understand why the Alpha Legion of all legions found itself aligned with Horus when the War Master embraced chaos and struck against the Emperor. The records are clear. Their martial pride combined with Alpharius' almost pathological avoidance of direct contact with his loyalist primarch siblings, and what contact he had was rather negative, save for Horus and maybe Sanguinius, set the stage for catastrophe. Yet what makes the Alpha Legion's turn to chaos particularly perplexing was ostensibly for the sake of the Imperium itself. This is because during a campaign of Imperial compliance upon Earth, roughly 2 standard years prior to the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the twin primarchs were approached by an individual known as John Grammaticus, an agent of the alien cabal. Alongside him were 2 companions, Petros Soneca and a sacker known as Shire. The cabal revealed to Alpharius Omegon a vision of the future, the impending rise of Horus as War Master and the interstellar civil war that would ensue. 2 divergent paths were presented to them. If the Emperor triumphed, the Imperium would eventually stagnate and slowly decay over 10 to 20 millennia until the galaxy itself and trillions of human souls were consumed by chaos. If Horus won, he would, in the generations following, be racked with guilt for slaying their father. Yet in doing so, he would obliterate all chaos-tainted factions, and humanity itself would burn in a near constant state of internecine warfare, seeing as no other enemies would remain. Now, in this scenario, chaos would be eliminated in its entirety, however at the horrifying cost to humanity as a whole. The twin primarchs recoiled at this revelation, and yet in their eyes, following Horus and manipulating the path from there became their only way to safeguard humanity from the very corruption that the Imperium could seemingly not prevent. Their loyalty remained with the Emperor as a whole, as during certain events, Alpharius and or Omegon would warn loyalists and actively act to decrease the cost of lives on the loyalist side, sabotaging chaos, though not in a way that would wholly allow the loyalists true victory. Because despite the Cabal's predictions, Alpharius and Omegon chose a different path. If both directions ended with humanity suffering a terrible fate in a mere 20,000 years, they would act in a way that would balance the scales. No path would be taken, no side would be allowed to win, and the great game would be used to perpetuate the existence of humanity for as long as possible, regardless of the amount of suffering that it would incur. In this way, it is within the twisted calculus of the 20th Legion that a stalemate had to be reached, one of enduring devotion, where the balance of the great game would be maintained, not by the powers of humanity's God King, and not by the entities, the gibbering psychic gestalts who saw themselves as gods. This is to the point that some believe that now that the balance of the scales has been tilted so far into the side of chaos, that the Alpha Legion seeks to free the Emperor from his prison upon the Golden Throne, forcing balance in a heavy-handed way. When the heresy erupted at the atrocity of Isvan III, it seems the Alpha Legion had a hand in some of the traitors' lines being rather permeable. But as the Horus Heresy was about to truly take shape, the Alpha Legion was poised for action. At Isvan V, it seems, a large part of the traitors' actual planning for the Dropsite Massacre would come from Alpharius and Omegon, as a force estimated at around 50,000 legionaries directly under Alpharius' command would respond to Rogel Dorn's orders to attack the traitor legions. This contingent was drawn from at least 2 separate expeditionary fleets, who had recently returned to the forge world of Lucius for resupply after extended campaigns along the galactic fringe. As for years prior, the Alpha Legion seemed to have been almost utterly absent from the Great Crusade, fostering the illusion, at least, of loyalty to Terra's high command. Dorn, confident in their neutrality, could not have suspected a web of infiltration and subterfuge, which the Alpha Legion had so clearly woven. However, neither could Horus. As the Dropsite Massacre was about to start, one of the twin primarchs, or both, had decided to act, as they directly warned Corax, Vulcan, and Ferris before the battle, to be cautious, as Alpharius contacted Corax, hoping him and Vulcan could persuade Ferris, who had lost his head to his temper, not to attack immediately, openly telling the primarchs of the Shattered Legions that Horus was clearly baiting them into attack, and that their forces rushing as they were right now and being the first on the planet was utter insanity. Alpharius instead directly asked Ferris Manus to siege Isvan, to use his vast depth of skills in order to preserve his forces. At the same time, it seems a few select words were passed on to the Primarchs, and Angron's buttons were intentionally pushed, as even at this time he believed in the nobility of gladiatorial combat, a force being met with force, yet he was assigned to work with Fulgrim, who at this time believed much like Horus that the Dropsite Massacre would have to be fought in a more demonic way. All the while, Mortarion was further and further pushed to work with demonic forces. Each of these incidents had the traitor forces almost destabilized at this point, with Angron having to be forced to cease his attempted attacks on Fulgrim for desiring the Loyalists be given a fair chance to fight, and Mortarion threatened outright rebellion if he was pushed any further to working with Horus's demonic allies. Furthermore, Alpharius would have his own forces actively work to preserve some of the Loyalist forces, not so many as to seem disloyal or to have turned on Horus, but enough to keep the Loyalists alive, despite the Loyalists having done everything in their power to have their forces exterminated, with their actions causing a gum up of Horus's rebellion, leading to a significantly longer amount of time being wasted by the traitors in Isvan V. However, with how foolhardy the Loyalists had been, for Alpharius's plans to continue with the least amount of deviation, he had to set his forces to slaughter everyone they could at the Ulgral Depression, and to steal the literal faces off dead Raven Guard members. Functionally, the Legion worked in two ways now. One Primarch actively tried to help the traitors, while the other fought against them. This would function as a third path, one the Cabal had not seen, as both paths suggested by the Cabal were seen as unacceptable. However, the Alpha Legion would indeed often follow Horus's plans, not to the letter, but generally in spirit. Yet even Horus, for all his confidence in the Alpha Legion's loyalty, seemed to notice the influence of their operations, supplies misdirected, orders subverted, allies pitted against each other, chaos cultivated carefully within chaos's own shadow. Yet even then, despite Horus distrusting them, he knew their loyalty was conditional and their motives unreadable to him. It seems it took Horus far too long to realize once the Hydra was finally enchained, history would prove all the Legion's mistrust upon the Alpha Legion to be correct. To better understand how things went, we must dive a little bit deeper into the Imperial's own perspective of the Dropsite Massacre. The Dropsite Massacre still remains to Imperials as one of the most devastating events in the Adeptus Astartes history, where the Iron Hands were all but eliminated, the Raven Guard reduced to near extinction, and the Salamanders left as mere cinders of their once glorious pyre. Their survival was only owed to what the Imperials believed was initiative, luck, and quick thinking. Following Horus's treachery on Isvan III, Rogaldorn, on direct instruction from the Emperor, mobilized at least 7 Loyalist Space Marine Legions, or what he believed them to be 7 Loyalist Space Marine Legions, to strike at Horus's fortification on Isvan V. The assault would be divided into 2 waves under Ferris Manus' overall command. The first wave would be the Raven Guard, the Iron Hands, and the Salamanders, who would secure the drop site at the Ulgral Depression, but this would be at a great cost. Unbeknownst to them, the second wave, which was made up of the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and a contingent of the Wordbearers, had pledged themselves to Horus and were lying in wait to strike at their flank. The Loyalists, believing these forces were their allies, would now be trapped between Two waves of traitors, Ferrus Manus, against the warnings of Corvus Corax and Vulcan, pursued what he would believe was a retreating enemy, only to be confronted by his brother Primarch Fulgrim in mortal combat. And so the Iron Hands were cut off and slaughtered to a man, Morlock Terminators included, and Ferrus Manus would be the first Primarch to die. During the Horus Heresy, the Salamanders and the Raven Guard would be forced to break out under heavy fire, having lost a majority of their forces, as they had to use a myriad of Thunderhawk and Stormbird gunships to attempt to carry the survivors to some form of safety. And they would be the ones to tell the Imperium about this unmitigated disaster. Corax himself would be gravely injured, and Vulcan's whereabouts were unknown for a time, many believing he had been slaughtered. But due to his perpetual nature, he would survive literally being nuked, and the Iron Hands would be left broken, leaderless, and decimated. And here, as always with the 20th Legion, one must remember what little we know about the Alpha Legion, what remnants exist of its history, can never truly form a coherent pattern. However, what the Imperium has at this point surmised is that with the Alpha Legion there are known knowns, and that there are known unknowns. But most importantly, there are also unknown unknowns, things that we don't know, And so the Alpha Legion's involvement in the Horus Heresy would officially in the chaotic aftermath of the Dropsite Massacre at Isstvan 5, the Cabal, ever watchful, ever manipulative, sought to employ the Alpha Legion as their instrument to ensure Horus's decisive triumph would occur, and their preferred plan for humanity played out. And this occurred as the shattered remnants of the 19th Legion, battered and demoralized, retreated to their homeworld of deliverance. Unbeknownst to them, the Alpha Legion had already infiltrated their ranks, surgically altered their operatives, and meticulously disguised themselves as fallen Raven Guard from Isstvan 5. All the while, they quietly observed and gathered intelligence, their presence undetectable even when under the direct, watchful eye of Primarch Corvus Corax. However, not all would be to the Cabal's designs. As true to their nature, the Alpha Legion decided to wield the blade themselves and carve a third path for humanity. Not a true victory for the Imperium or for Horus, one that would perpetuate the existence of humanity as long as possible. The Alpha Legion's patience here was methodical. They waited until Corax functionally was able to reconstitute his legion by using samples of pure Primarch pre-creation DNA strains provided personally by the God Emperor, and only once the Raven Guard achieved the critical breakthrough to build up their forces to significant numbers, the legionaries struck, tainting the genetic stock and transforming the new aspirants into usable yet grotesque malformed abominations, allowing the Raven Guard to have the forces to continue to some degree within the Horus Heresy, but not to significant enough numbers to completely upset the balance they sought to create. Concurrently, rebellions were fomented amongst the tech guilds of Kitavar, the Forge World orbiting Deliverance. Here the Alpha Legion forces camouflaged themselves as Raven Guard and staged surgical strikes intended to destabilize the planet entirely, further limiting the Raven Guard's operational abilities without completely taking them out of the game, since the loyalist Raven Guard, through what to the Imperium is said to be determination and heroism, suppressed the uprisings in a record-breaking amount of time and eliminating the infiltrators post-haste. However, Alpharius would ensure that critical data on the corrupted gene stock and any remnants of the original gene designs remained squarely in the hands of the 20th Legion, leaving the chief apothecary of the Emperor's children, Fabius Bile, with only mere fragments that were so damaged that he could not use to further his experimentation. Whether Alpharius sought to elevate his legion above all others, or merely to preserve tools for future operations, remains a matter of mostly speculation. Soon after this, Omegon met with the Cabal's representative, Aetherurur, aboard his flagship. After a terse exchange, he declared that the Alpha Legion would act independently, forging the path they believed was best, free from external oversight and out of the control of the Cabal. This was a decision consistent with their long-standing tradition of almost absolute autonomy. Here, the Alpha Legion would also seize an additional objective, the Emperor's gift of pure Primarch pre-differentiation gene stock, which Fabius Bile was led to believe was completely destroyed, as were the Cabal, misleading both the traitors and the external group that sought to control them, while safeguarding the true samples for their own design. And though a demonic virus had been applied to compromise the gene stock that they had secured for themselves, the Alpha Legion had reportedly only created it with the explicit caveat of them having the secret ability to remove it, or so the tech adepts of the Dark Mechanicus assured them before they were slaughtered, in order to preserve the secret. Whether this is true or not remains a mystery. Their secondary aim was to destroy the Raven Guard's gene seed, but somehow that mysteriously failed, in a manner that wouldn't completely take out the loyalists Astartes, but would keep them in the fight at a significantly decreased capacity. In 006 M31, the Alpha Legion would take part in the first battle of Paramore, on the world of Paramore 5, which was positioned in the northern edge of Segmentum Solar. This became a key target in the early days of the Horus Heresy, serving as both a staging point and a vital supply terminus for Imperial expeditionary fleets, meant that Paramar lay almost directly between Isfahan and Terra. Before the blood that had been spilled on Isfahan 5 had even cooled, the Alpha Legion, under the guise of careful subterfuge, orchestrated a massive assault. They were followed by a second armada of primarily Dark Mechanicum forces and the Legio Ferranus Titans. The fiercest engagement of this battle occurred on Landing Zone Secundus, within the Paramore Nexus. Here, 8 to 10 maniples of Tiger Eyes Traitor Titans strode into the deserted spaceport, anticipating minimal resistance. Unfortunately, they encountered Titans of the Legio Griffianicus, Loyalist Mechanicum troopers, and Loyalist Iron Warriors from the 77th Grand Battalion. Despite this unexpected opposition, the Alpha Legion's initial strike would prove to be devastating. With overwhelming firepower and the calculated application of numerically superior forces allowed the traitors to seize the Paramar Nexus, leaving the world under Horus's control with minimal disruption to military stockpiles. The next event of galactic scale that would in some way involve the Alpha Legion would be the Culling of the Wolves, circa 007 M31. Following the fall of Prospero, the depleted Space Wolves had found themselves ensnared by the Alpha Legion in a protracted naval engagement within the Alexis Nebula. Superior in number and fresher in forces, the 20th Legion's forces forced the Wolves deeper and deeper still into a maze of corrosive fogs and treacherous stellar corridors. Every maneuver of the 6th Legion had been anticipated. Even the sacrificing of lighter vessels was employed to secure opportunities to strike heavier targets. Finally, as the Space Wolves were cornered and their annihilation seemed imminent, reinforcements arrived in the form of the Dark Angels. The Ramlius-class Starfort Chimera inflicted grievous wounds upon the Alpha Legion's flagship, forcing a reluctant retreat. Though Lehman Russ survived, the encounter had humbled the 6th Legion in a manner previously unimagined. The myth of the Space Wolves' nigh invincibility, already tarnished, was further shattered in the coils of the Great Hydra. Then would come the blockade at Chondak. Following the turbulence of Isfahan 5, Alpharius turned his gaze to the Chondak system, intent on preventing the White Scars from joining the Loyalist forces in the wider galaxy. The 5th Legion would remain blissfully ignorant to the grand scale of the conflict until Omegon initiated a strike against Tenebrae 950. A strategically significant asteroid facility used as an Alpha Legion garrison. Here the 20th Legion employed a pylon array to jam communications, ensuring that the White Scars stayed in the dark regarding Horus's rebellion. Leading a one-way near self-termination strike, Sheed Ranko, commander of the Alpha Legion team, sent to obliterate the facility, and they succeeded. Some historians argue that the Legion may have manufactured claims of the site leaking intelligence as a pretext for allowing the White Scars to finally learn of the Horus Heresy and to join in the fighting, creating the stability they required following the destruction of the space. After this, surprisingly enough, the warp turbulence in the sector momentarily subsided, permitting for communication from Terra to reach the White Scars. In particular, orders of recalls from Rogel Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, would finally reach the Scars. As the White Scars prepared to depart, they encountered the Alpha Legion flotilla, lingering in the system's edge, silent, inscrutable, and unmoving. The 20th vessels maintained a cordon, quietly amassing reinforcements across nearby space. All communications from the White Scars were met with utter silence, and orders from the Khan himself restrained escalation. The 5th Legion was instructed to maintain the fleet's integrity and to prevent Alpha Legion forces from infiltrating their rank. Yet when the White Scars executed a sudden precision strike, an arrow formation which sliced through the void, the 20th Legion never deployed heavier ships in order to pin them down. Despite appearances, the cordon was never meant to kill or do any realistic harm, but rather to test and perhaps mislead or dissuade the White Scars from joining in the brouhaha at this time, and thus, without heavy bombardment, the White Scars slipped free, leaving a trail of flaming Alpha Legion wreckage in its wake. The Battle of the Chondak system proper, occurring in 007 M31, encompassed worlds such as Efrikion, Terras, Hondril, Latrex, and Primus Bor, and became the center of the White Scars' primary campaigns following the triumph of Ulnor. Chondak's Prime, known amongst the Khan's warriors as White World for its salt-like terrain, was the stage of the final remnants of Orc warlord Uruk, whose forces had been hunted down by the White Scars for 6 long years. It was in this area that they were intentionally delayed by the Alpha Legion, as it seems the entire campaign was a long-term misdirection. The next event of galactic note would be the capture of Amnesiacs. The Amnesiacs was a super heavy arc freighter from the Heliodyne shipyards, and it carried battle group Astramax of Legio Penetrea to Terra. This was a prize of immense strategic value. The Alpha Legion saw this opportunity and activated 50 legionaries under the strike commander Dartan Virax, aided by a network of Spragoi agents masquerading as empty suits of newly forged power armor, and the legionaries themselves would awake mid-transit after the Amnesiac was rerouted to Calstrai Mundi in order to crush a rebellion. Through a series of precise and brutal operations, the Alpha Legion infiltrated the ship proper, sabotaging its communications and eliminating the astropathic choir, creating chaos amongst the Mechanicum defenders. Even heavily armored Castellax automata fell to the Legion's Banestrike ammunition, while deliberate incineration of crew quarters, scrambled sensors, and tactical coordination allowed them to maintain combat superiority. Even the ship's Magos Dominus was assassinated in short order after the attack proper began. When resistance persisted, Virax enacted a contingency. A warmonger-class Abyssus Edax Titan would open fire from the cargo hold, eradicating the Mechanicum forces in one devastating strike, securing total control of the Amnesiacs, including the cryogenically preserved Titan and their princeps on board. During the Horus Heresy, the Alpha Legion proved itself capable of operations, rivaling their loyalist counterparts. One of the incidents that best showed this off occurred at Talran, when they delivered a string of defeat to the White Scars, also at Yarant, where they humiliated the Space Wolves, and across a dozen outposts. They struck efficiently in a manner that even the Raven Guard would be hard-pressed to deny was anything but perfect. During this epoch of the Horus Heresy, the 20th Legion proper would remain a rather nebulous force, one which, when acting as one, no one truly knew if they were fighting a full legion or only a handful of operatives, or even whose side they were on, as traitor forces for some reason kept disappearing throughout this epoch, and it seems loyalists kept sporadically getting the upper hand on them, despite conditions making it nigh impossible. In the wake of Chondax, Alpharius had ordered the remainder of his strike fleet to strike at the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, as they regrouped in the Alexis Nebula. Leman Russ, weary and battered from the fall of Prospero, a campaign that left the Thousand Suns homeworld in ashes following their defiance of the Emperor's decree absolute, sought refuge to lick their wounds with their tails between their legs. The 20th Legion, under the twin primarchs Alpharius and Omegon, launched a calculated move, motivated equally by strategy as personal vendettas, as Leman Russ had long criticized the Alpha Legion for their reliance on deception and subterfuge rather than brute forcing conflicts through direct combat. A grudge Alpharius was eager to exploit. Their objective was rather simple: delay the Space Wolves and preventing them from arriving at Terra too soon, keeping them from bolstering the Imperial defenses more than necessary. Russ issued a distress call to the nearby White Scars, imploring Jaghatai Khan to intervene. Yet the Kagan, unsure which of the Primarchs was truly his ally, and whom were the real traitors? Honestly, a fair question at the time, especially with how masterful the Alpha Legion had been through the entirety of the heresy up to this point, refused to commit until astropathic signals could be decoded from Terra. For a time, they sat and watched the ongoing brouhaha. Demoralized, and rightfully so, Leman Russ temporarily withdrew from command, leaving First Captain Gunnar Gunherald to lead in his absence. But when the Alpha Legion pressed their attack, the Wolf King returned to the bridge of his flagship Harmfkurl, rallying his legion behind him. During the battle, Cataphracti Terminators of the Alpha Legion's elite Learn and cohort teleported aboard the flagship, and Russ reportedly engaged in close combat with one who appeared to be Alpharius, which, seeing as almost a quarter of the Loyalist Primarchs believed themselves to have fought Alpharius, it makes this incident rather dubious. Just as the feat seemed inevitable for the Space Wolves, this was when the Dark Angels arrived and saved the day. Now, the Alpha Legion was also involved in the incidents involving the Shattered Legion, in particular involving the ship known as the Sisyphum, and their involvement is primarily known thanks to the accounts of Raven Guard specialist Nyokan Sharokin, who recounts at least one Primarch, presumably Alpharius, operated from a hidden facility on Lorena 212, while masquerading as an Iron Hands war leader known as Shadrach Medusan, using the Sisyphum's crew to hunt down Loyalist elements. Supposedly, and this is a big question, there are some who believed that the Sisyphum was used to hunt down Loyalist elements within the 20th Legion, Alpharius' deception remaining hidden until the surviving forces escaped, finally realizing that Medusan was an Alpha Legion operative. However, we do not know if this operative was actually Alpharius or just everyone thinking they fought Alpharius throughout the entirety of the heresy. This was a successful move by the Alpha Legion since it eliminated a lot of the rebellious elements of their legion while keeping the Sisyphum's crew busy. Up next would be the Solar War and the Imperial Palace infiltration, which occurred at the height of the chaos of the Imperial Civil War, when the Alpha Legion, having maintained networks capable of moving personnel and material across sectors, decided to use their influence to move things from Segmentum Solar to the Sol System, in particular, getting around the defenses made by the Imperial Fists and Rogel Dorn. This would be a feat of pure legend, as the areas they were crossing had been meticulously fortified, as each orbital and planetary layer had been transformed into a defensive bastion to completely counter Horus's eventual assault. Yet the 20th Legion, in a bid at least partly to prove their superiority, sought more than just tactical victory. They aimed to humiliate the Imperial Fist by directly infiltrating the Imperial Palace itself. The Alpha Legion's operatives, who had been trained to operate under multiple, rather unique mission parameters, were sent out. These parameters often could vary rather distinctly. One operative might be tasked with protecting an individual, activating countless scores of loyalist Alpha Legionnaires kept in stasis beneath the Imperial Palace, while another individual might be sent out to kill a single person, potentially even a custodian. All of these activations would be done through singular commands, transmitted via Vox or scrolled on parchment, which would instantly shift an operative either to being a loyalist or being a traitor upon activation. However, after activation, that activation command could no longer be re-implemented. This methodology allowed dormant Alpha Legion assets to be hidden in Terra decades before the Horus Heresy had ever started, and for them to succeed where others had failed, as several operatives had already penetrated the Investuary, a hall which housed the statues commemorating the Primarchs, while others were deep beneath the Imperial Palace, even unknown to the custodians of the God Emperor himself. This area, containing the statues of all the Primarchs, only had two areas that were completely empty, those of the two lost primarchs. And rather than a tactical victory, the Alpha Legion had chosen this moment to target the statues of all aside from Alfarius and Rogel Dorn, or potentially Omegon and Rogel Dorn. We can't really be sure. This was a calculated insult, delivered silently, even bypassing the Regent of Terra, Malcador the Sigillite. Now the question on how exactly he discovered this breach and this destruction is unknown, but he is the only one who noticed anything and spoke up. Shortly thereafter, an Alpha Legion fleet under Pyromaster Kel Solenus struck the Sol System's outer defenses, capturing several moons of Pluto in a singular devastating strike, taking the outermost Imperial bastion for the Alpha Legion. The true extent of these operations remains a closely guarded secret, known only to Rogel Dorn and his elite Huskarls, though due to the Alpha Legion's love of misdirection, it's equally likely that the records that remain are actually edited lies or outright falsehoods. In the year 008 M31, a previously unrecorded Black Shields faction calling themselves the Dark Brotherhood carved out a rogue Corsair empire along the edges of the Pale Stars. Their long-running conflict with the Alpha Legion Hunter-Killer Detachment shows that the Legion operated on multiple fronts, not only attacking the Imperium itself, but also those who had betrayed the Imperium and attempted to create their own small kingdom. The Legion's tactics in this combat situation combined infiltration, sabotage, and psychological warfare, although these engagements were seen by the greater Imperium and Chaos itself as a choreographed misdirection, rather than the Alpha Legion actually dedicating large forces to this conflict. At the same time, an Alpha Legion strike group conducted a series of raids on the outskirts of the Liesos system in the Segmentum Pacificus, inflicting heavy casualties upon colony habitats of the system's 3 agri-worlds. Those survivors, if that's truly what they were, returned home infected with a previously unknown agri-pathogen. Within a year, this biological agent obliterated the system's entire macro output saturation field, transforming them into poisonous sludge. The resulting famine claimed nearly 90 billion lives in a single swoop, necessitating almost no active combat from the Alpha Legion. Then there's the Battle of Pluto, which occurred as Horus's march on Terra loomed ever larger. At this time, the Alpha Legion was tasked with the sabotage and the crippling of the Sol System as a whole, from deep within. Despite the heavily fortified outer defenses held by the Imperial Fist, as stated above, an individual who we believe is Alfarius personally commanded the Alpha Legion's flagship, initiating a nearly year-long drift towards the Sol System with almost the entirety of its fleet in stasis, minimizing the heat signatures in order to avoid detection. Sleeper cells planted years before the Horus Heresy ever even began, simultaneously activated across the Sol System, sowing chaos and diverting the defenders' attention, or so we are led to believe. Acts of murder, sabotage, arson on multiple planets simultaneously ensured that Rogel Dorn and his forces were preoccupied with cries for aid far from Pluto, diverting the bulk of his forces. At this time, the true target of the 20th Legion was in fact Pluto. Upon arrival, Alfarius' fleet, numbering over 200 vessels strong, assaulted Pluto and its moons, Charon, Erebus, Nyx, Styx, and Hydra. Ironically enough, their true objective was Hydra, a fortress moon housing critical astropathic monitoring stations. Loyalist forces here were under the command of First Captain Sigismund, and they numbered in only 30 ships, yet they were able to hold the line valiantly. Fireships hidden amongst the Alpha Legion's fleet wreaked havoc upon the defenders, while Kerberos bombarded its neighboring moons with nearly unmatched firepower. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Imperial Fist held out until reinforcements could come from the Phalanx, and a fleet of Imperial Fists along with Armada Imperialis warship. At the climax of the battle, Rogel Dorn personally led an assault on Hydra, confronting who we are led to believe was Alfarius in direct melee combat. Dorn would strike down Alfarius, forcing the 20th Legion to withdraw. Yet, as it is ever so often the case with the Alpha Legion and all the Primarchs who have killed an Alpha Legion Primarch, there are doubts whether they indeed killed a Primarch or even in the case that Alpharius was truly slain, that Omegon potentially took his place, or that Omegon was the one who was slain, and Alpharius was the one who took Alpharius's place as Alpharius. This is due to the identity of the twin primarchs being twins having been unknown to either Horus or the Imperials. It is even posited that to this day, Chaos itself does not know the truth of the twin primarchs. And while history records the death of Alpharius, the fate of the 20th Legion remains truly unknown, in large part due to subterfuge. To go into further detail on the final battle between Alpharius and Rogaldorn, or at least who we believe is Alpharius, which occurred during the Battle of Pluto, we see that Rogaldorn's elite Huskarls fought valiantly, and it was Archimedes, master of the Huskarls, who first deduced the Alpha Legion's true objective, or at least what we are led to believe was their true objective: the sabotage of the Imperial Astropathic Network centered on Hydra, leading a contingent on a daring assault upon Alpharius' personal forces. Archimedes would be cut down, mortally wounded, as the battle began to tip towards the traitor's favor. Then, when it could only be described as the most perfect of timing, the mobile fortress known as the Phalanx, carrying aboard it the Primarch Rogaldorn, arrived with a massive contingent of Imperial fists alongside their fleet, utilizing the Sol System's gravity wells like a cosmic slingshot in a manner all too reminiscent of Tau technology. Dorn's reinforcements arrived with an efficiency that was almost impossible to predict, and with devastating firepower, they pacified and captured the guns on Kerberos, enabling a direct assault on Hydra's astropathic chamber. Dorn and his remaining Huskarls teleported directly into the chamber and confronted Alpharius and his elite Terminator Guard. Archimedes, barely alive, watched helplessly as the duel unfolded. Dorn cut, Storm's teeth blurred. Alpharius swayed back, pivoting, sliding a hair's breadth past the screaming edge. Archimedes lunged to his lord's side, his sax blade reaching for the spear thrust even as it unfolded. His left hand was locked around the spear's haft. For an instant, the two Primarchs were an arm's reach apart, eye to eye. Brother, Alpharius began, and Dorn hacked Storm's teeth through Alpharius' arms above the wrist. Blood and sparks fell in the flash of gunfire. The world became a slow, sliding tableau of movement. Dorn's face, cold stone, marked with blood and strobing shadows as he pulled the spear from his shoulder. Alpharius, staggering, lashed out with a kick. Another cut, scrying from left to right. Storm's teeth ripping armor like parchment. Red gloss, sheen on indigo blue, and a demigod felling. His torso an open cave of meat and bone. The only sound was the growl of Storm's teeth and the clang as Alpharius struck the deck and began to rise, strength defying the red ruin of his body. Dorn, still spear in one hand. But victory, Alpharius gasped. Dorn rammed the spear through his brother's chest. The tip punched through the power plant on the back of Alpharius' armor. Alpharius' mouth opened, his eyes wide. A great wash of blood poured from between his teeth. Dorn held him on the spear. The two, so close it seemed almost an embrace. The air around them was burning like a heat haze as the blood struck the floor. A high wail rising with a coil of wind, which circled the pair. Alpharius' mouth moved, forming words as Dorn was still for a second, his eyes blank and black in the canvas of his stone face. Then he pushed Alpharius away. Snakes of light whirled through the air. The Primarch of the Alpha Legion staggered, mouth still moving. Rogaldorn brought Storm's teeth around. The blade cut down through Alpharius' skull, then tore free in a spray of blood and a detonation of light. The last planet of the solar system turned in silence. Explosions finished, and ships' guttural glows, and ships glittered like snow falling through winter night. Lives ended. They ended in small spaces, with the air sucked away. In the roar of gunfire pouring through passages, in the spinning blackness that were the last sights given to them, was the blink of explosions and the light of stars. And they ended in the heart of a moon, with the blood of a being who had been more than human, but less than a god, pooling on a floor of cold iron. Rogaldorn, the Praetorian of Terra, looked down at the corpse of his brother. Around him, the world turned. Groups of warriors appeared in fresh flashes of teleportation light. They spread through the vault as the doors crashed open, and Kratos ran in and saw the sight none would believe. A moment that should have stopped the galaxy in its access. A primarch dead at the hands of a brother. Within sight of the world of their creation. But the soul system turned without pause, unknowing or uncaring. With their primarch slain, the Alpha Legion's fleet withdrew. At the moment of Alfarius' death, Omegon sensed the law, and with a chilling calm assumed his brother's identity, permanently, unbeknownst to Horus or the Imperium. From this point forward, any and all actions attributed to the Alpha Legion flowed through the singular mind of Omegon, or Alfarius. Once again, we can't truly be sure who was who at any point. For the remainder of the Horus Heresy, the 20th Legion fractured its operations, withdrawing from the main forces of Terra rather than rejoining at the climactic siege, besides a detachment that was sent in order to activate some supposedly loyalist elements of the Alpha Legion stored beneath the Palace of Terra. And despite an agent being sent to awaken them, said agent failed by being slain, so they remain to this day. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, during the Great Scouring, the Alpha Legion would be confronted by the Ultramarines on Escador. Here, Raboot Guilliman faced off against Alfarius, or Omegon, masquerading as Alfarius, or even an Alpha Legion legionnaire, masquerading as Omegon, masquerading as Alfarius. Following one of the Primarch's deaths on Pluto, the Ultramarines would be dragged into a conflict, with the Alpha Legion's own Primarch being used as bait to lead them into perfect positions to strike. First to arrive on the planet, Alfarius was able to choose his battleground, for he knew that Ultramarines would not rest until they had hunted down all the traitors. The Alpha Legion deployed deep within the harsh mountain ranges, at the very pole of the planet, riven with gillis, ravines, and high passes that would seriously hamper movement, especially for ground vehicles. Alfarius was convinced that the battle would be won by the side which overcame these problems best. Through forward planning, coordinated air transports, and detachments coping independently of heavy support was how he intended the conflict to be won. Guilliman was a military commander with few peers. However, a fatal flaw was that all the experiences, lessons, and tactics he had accumulated over centuries had been carefully documented, compiled, and made accessible to the other legions, in the Primarch's almost biological desire to improve the Emperor's armies as a whole. Now this gave Alfarius the advantage because he knew how the Ultramarines would operate. Indeed, Guilliman's initial deployment followed exactly the doctrines set down by his own writings to the letter, and the Alpha Legion moved to trap them. But Guilliman chose the first nightfall to do something unexpected. Breaking his own rules of operation, he led a large portion of his forces deep into the mountain, deploying by Thunderhawk, drop pod, and teleporters into the midst of the Alpha Legions with no known lines of support, supply, or reinforcement. Guilliman had targeted the high command of the enemy by directly deciding to assault none other than Alfarius. And while direct records of the combat between the two Primarchs are scant, if any, what we do have is the records from a singular Ultramarine who had logged what he had seen, and it goes as follows. As we closed upon the traitors, Alfarius himself led a counterattack, charging headlong down the rocky slope with his bodyguard slamming into our line. Not even Ultramarines could stand before a Primarch, and his power sword felled every noble space marine within reach. Our advance was halted, and I was forced to recite the Canticle of Faith to steady my squad. But then an imposing figure appeared, and my heart was gladdened. Our Lord, Primarch Raboot Guilliman himself, strode forward, ignoring the melee around him, straight towards Alfarius. The two Primarchs stood in equal stature, both clad in shining power armor, and each wielding a glittering power sword. But where one was noble, the other was craven. Where one was loyal, the other was a betrayer. All other combat ceased as we watched them. There was a long pause, neither Primarch moving an inch. Then both struck in an instant. Each sword made a single stroke. Then both were still again. For a second, the two great men stood facing, before Alfarius slumped to the ground. Alfarius, having collapsed immediately, led the Ultramarines to be emboldened by what they believe to this day to have been their Primarch's victory, leading them to unleash a relentless attack, wiping out every visible Alpha Legionary in the area, but victory proved fleeting. For over the next solar week, the remnants of the Alpha Legion, having been hidden in very specific locations and allied with the natives of the world, harassed and cut down Guilliman's forces significantly from every direction. Ultimately, the Ultramarines were forced to retreat, having their hand shown and accepting that they had been tactically defeated, necessitating the bombardment of the planet from orbit. Despite Guilliman's protestations about the Legion's dishonorable tactics, history leaves little room to dispute the fact that even without Alfarius, at least to our knowledge, the Alpha Legion's shadowy adaptive strategies have allowed them to continue to outmaneuver the Imperium's most disciplined forces to this day. By the end of the heresy and the death of their final primarch, the Alpha Legion, or perhaps what remains of it, demonstrated that victory in war does not always belong to the largest army, nor even the mightiest primarch. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who can quietly pin down the enemy, whose true intentions are as layered and as undecipherable as their existence. And if you're keeping track, supposedly there hasn't been, to any real degree, a coherent or seemingly coherent Alpha Legion from the points of view of both the Imperium proper and the forces of Abaddon the Despoiler. However, this might be another ruse, as a stalemate that would perpetuate humanity, which seems to have been the goal of the Alpha Legion, has continued for the last 10,000 years. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Alpha Legion did something few other traitor legions dared. They did not retreat into the safety of the Eye of Terror. Instead, the 20th Legion pressed into the galactic east, pursuing objectives all their own, ones that confounded both Imperial and traitor forces alike. Unlike their peers, the Alpha Legion became embroiled in a series of bitter confrontations with the Ultramarines directly, who themselves were entrenched in the region following Horus's assault on Terra. On Escador, the Alpha Legion faced the Ultramarines in what would become a textbook, if unusually theatrical version, of strategic deception. Alfarius, reportedly delighted, saw the engagement as a chance to demonstrate the superiority of his legion's own flexible doctrine, believing his unpredictable methods and the overall methodology of his legion was superior to the methodical, rigorously codified doctrines of Raboot Guilliman. Guilliman, however, had anticipated the legion's resilience and foresight, along with their overconfidence. Perhaps for the only time in his career until the 42nd millennium, he deliberately acted contrary to his meticulous doctrines, setting up a trap so precise that he supposedly ensnared Alfarius himself. However, the accounts on this incident differ greatly, in particular on the motivations for the encounter. Some claim that Alfarius sought to prove the brilliance of his tactics. Others suggest that Guilliman pursued vengeance against the traitor legions for their role in the wounding of the Emperor and the slaying of Sanguinius. Alfarius' forces supposedly arrived first, selecting the battleground, whereas the Ultramarines, deploying via Thunderhawk, Drop Pod, and Teleport Homer, went straight into the heart of the Alpha Legion's defenses. The surprise itself was devastating, as the 20th Legion's command structure was a true objective of the Ultramarines, and their forces, outnumbered 5-1, were supposedly forced to stay and fight at the head of the valley. In the climax of this attack, at least one Ultramarine states that Guilliman slayed Alfarius. However, the traditional visual signatures of a Primarch being slain did not occur. And having burned what they believed was Alfarius' body on a pyre, they proceeded to slog their way through multiple Alpha Legion operatives who were themselves in rather well-entrenched positions, to the point that it would seem like the entire affair had been set up. That is, if you believe the accounts of a lone Ultramarine, as no other direct record of this event exists. And eventually, Guilliman was forced to retreat, abandoning all hope and orbitally bombarding the planet in order to wipe out any enemy resistance. However, Imperial scholars who have seen the Ultramarines' account argue that the entire battle was orchestrated by the Alpha Legion as a single multi-layered deception, as it would remove pressure from their Primarch, making everyone believe that he had been slain, and it forced Guilliman to retreat, essentially signaling that his legion was in fact inferior. Following Escador, the Alpha Legion would fracture, deliberately scattering across Imperial space in small autonomous warbands, which would be established within hidden bases in asteroid fields, derelict space hulks, and barren worlds, striking at weakened Imperial targets. And this would be long after the heresy had ended. Even today, these remnants continue to operate in the shadow of the Imperium, striking from the darkness with cunning and a persistence that has defined their legion for generations. In the turbulent wake of the Great Scouring, before the 100th century of M31, many of the traitor remnants had fled far into the reaches of Imperial space in order to hide. Most, if not almost all of them, headed straight for the Eye of Terror. Amongst the traitors that did not go directly into the Great Rift was Diant Mal, architect of the Raven Guard's ignominious defeat at the Battle of Lex, pushed outwards by the resurgent armies of the Emperor of Mankind. Diant Mal and his warband would take refuge in the dark marches of Segmentum Tempestus. There, he struck at Amara Prime, obliterating a major outpost and assembling a entourage of renegades, mutants, and heretics who would call themselves the Shadowed Ones. For decades, hidden amongst debris fields and nebulas that would one day form the Orpheus sector, Diant Mal's forces struck at Imperial expeditions, establishing a reign of terror that spanned decades upon decades. While the ultimate fate of the Shadowed Ones remains unclear, prevailing accounts suggest that Diant Mal met his end at the hands, or rather claws, of what many assume to be reawakened Necron forces of the Mayankar dynasty. Sometime later, word would reach the High Lords of Terra of a Chaos Lord claiming the identity of Alfarius, ravaging the adamantine-laced moons of the Danvra subsector. Debates raged over the possibility of such a claim being true, given that Alfarius' death had been recorded multiple times across history, but no proof of a true Primarch felling had arisen. In large part, this was due to the 20th Legion's flair for confusion, misdirection, and subterfuge. In response, the Officio Assassinorum dispatched 6 elite Vindicare assassins over the course of several standard years. These operatives identified and eliminated a dozen Chaos champions claiming the name of Alfarius. Yet reports of ongoing raids only grew. 5 years later, the decapitated heads of all 6 Vindicare assassins were discovered frozen in the very food storage halls of the High Lords of Terra, as a grim reminder of the Alpha Legion's reach. Later still, the Shrouded Hand, a brotherhood of Alpha Legion chosen, infiltrated the way station of Thrastia Jensen, a key logistical hub for the Golgotha system. While probing the lower strata of society for recruits, they uncovered a hive of gene stealer cultists, inadvertently triggering a brutal uprising. The streets would then run red with blood as sleeper cells awakened by the Shrouded Hand, having sent coded messages, waged a ferocious guerrilla campaign against the cultists. The Shrouded Hand would vanish without a trace, and once the planetary supply chain was crippled, Zarastria Jensen was left as a broken cog in the Golgotha war machine. Sometime after this, on the psycho-rich world of Seer's Rest, a plague of nightmares consumed the population. Oracles, hedge wizards, and seers reported recurring dreams of serpents reigning across the land. Dreams amplified by the planet's high psychic gestalt, manifesting physically as millions would perish to the venomous bites within a single day. Investigators from the Adeptus Arbites discovered too late that the world's terraforming engines had been spiked with psychotropic gas, heightening the psychic storm. And when the Alpha Legion forces descended to finish off the remaining Guardians, the psychic tempest had reached such an intensity that Seer's Rest was reclassified as a demon world. Thousands of comatose psychers would be abducted and placed into the Legion's custody. After this, in a masterstroke of manipulation, a coven of Alpha Legion sorcerers, leveraging psychic hypnosis, embedded double agents within the Administratum. And by doing so, they convinced Imperial authorities that the Averina system lay in the wrong location. When the Legion invaded Averina 3 and Primarina, psychic distress calls triggered a response. However, they would arrive at the wrong segmentum, as Imperial forces would prevent the fall of both the vital planets of Averina and Negligence within a single solar year. In 883 M37, the Zambesque Rebellion would occur, and it erupted planet-wide when the governor was questioned by the Dark Angel's Fifth Company, declaring open rebellion against the Emperor. The planet soon ambushed the visiting loyal forces, and they were aided by the Alpha Legion Chaos Space Marines. The timely intervention of half the Deathwing prevented the annihilation of the Fifth Company as a whole, and the investigation revealed that the governor was indeed a fallen Dark Angel named Solas, who had escaped with his Chaos allies seconds before the Imperial forces were able to restore order. Then would come the relief of Rhea's world, occurring in 814 M39. Rhea's world was a planetary penal facility, known for little else, and it had become a focal point of a concerted attack by a coalition of Alpha Legion warbands. Many within the Segmentum High Command were reluctant to commit already overstretched resources for its defense. Then, almost as if by cosmic coincidence, or perhaps the inscrutable will and desire of the Dark Angels, a strike force of the Sons of the Lion would intervene without warning or even request. The Alpha Legion warbands would be then routed and their commander captured, though the planet's populace remained blissfully unaware that this deliverance was merely a product of the Dark Angels' ongoing hunt for the fallen. Then would come the Gothic War, occurring during the 12th Black Crusade between 139 and 160 M41. The 12th Black Crusade was a sprawling campaign of death and destruction waged by Abaddon the Despoiler, spanning countless systems, with hundreds of planetary invasions, naval confrontations, and warp-borne maladies. Imperial records of the Alpha Legion's participation are rather scarce, and they're limited primarily to the relatively well-known Levée ambush. Yet anyone familiar with the 20th Legion knows that behind visible clashes, their invisible hand likely orchestrated many of the Chaos Front's successes through their spy networks, covert manipulations, and a careful stoking of rebellion on a planet or two, all choreographed so that the Legion's enemies never knew who was truly attacking them. Later still, another incident with the Alpha Legion's involvement would be the Darathu Plague, occurring in 255 M41. The agri-world of Darathu Prime suffered an unexpected calamity, spikes of a rather unique species of locust, previously unknown in the sector, and they erupted all across the planet. And in the planet's warm climate, these swarms multiplied exponentially, devastating crops and triggering planet-wide famine. Civil unrest would erupt in every major population center following this. Much of the planet's military would go so far as to join the rebellion. A Mordian Iron Guard regiment would be dispatched in order to restore order, only to be ambushed and annihilated by the hidden Chaos Space Marines, the loss of food exports triggering a cascading supply chain issue across the subsector for years to come. While no single witness could confirm the Alpha Legion's involvement, patterns, timings, misdirection, and specific tells suggest their unseen orchestration at every stage. Then, between 400 and 470 M41, the Monarchian heresy would occur. Throughout this heresy, the Alpha Legion allied Chaos cultists carried out subtle, calculated acts of infiltration and subversion, quietly tilting conflicts in their favor. Their manipulation were seldom acknowledged in official records, yet their outcome consistently favored the Alpha Legion's beguiling designs. Then, in 742 M41, the destruction of the Crimson Consuls would occur. The Crimson Consuls, a chapter of Loyalist Space Marines, would fall to the scheme and misdirection propagated by the Alpha Legion. Their destruction was orchestrated without the Alpha Legion ever appearing directly on the battlefield. Yet they claimed triumph over their lesser imperial kin. Then the Achilles Crusade would occur in 777 M41. During the Achilles Crusade, the Imperium aimed at restoring control over their Jericho Reach. As warbands of Alpha Legion consistently opposed Loyalist forces, the battle would continue to get more and more intense. Their tactics were precise and seemingly incidental, but the results speak of a pattern of long-term disruption that only the Alpha Legion could ever orchestrate. However, as it stands, the Jericho Reach seems to be squarely in the control of the Imperium, as they have multiple Death Watch stations within it. In 812 M41, a coalition of Alpha Legion warbands instigated a rebellion in the Munitorum Provender world of Luxor, threatening the flow of war material across the northern Ultima Segmentum. The Ultramarines eventually quelled this uprising, but the societal damage is still long-lasting, as insurrections continuously flared repeatedly over the next century, and some strategio savants trace the fall of the Armada cluster some 80 years later directly to the chronic undersupply that began in 812 M41. In 865 M41, Krennic's Valdorus, elevated to demonhood by the dark gods, became the target of the White Scar's Khosero Khan, who was tasked with bringing back the demon prince's head, or perish dying. The pursuit led the Khan to Quintus, where he discovered not a single warband, but an entire planet of traitors and renegades. Unexpected allies would then emerge, in the form of Kayvon Shrike and the Raven Guard's Third Company. Recognizing the extraordinary threat posed by Valdorus, the rival loyalist faction set aside their old enmities and united to strike a final blow against the planet's capital, Manakrava. The demon prince would then be slain, as his essence would dissipate into the ether. Yet one cannot help but notice that it seems even here the Alpha Legion had foreseen these events, as the majority of their forces were drawn out long before the main charge. Later, during the Tartarus campaign, the Third Company of the Blood Ravens, under the command of the venerated Captain Gabriel Angelos, was dispatched to support Imperial forces, defending the civilized world of Tartarus, itself currently under siege by an orc war. And what began as a straightforward defensive action quickly unfolded into a labyrinthian maze of hidden threats and betrayals. As the campaign progressed, the Blood Ravens uncovered Tartarus' dark history, a planet littered with relics of the Eldar. Relics that they instinctually felt like collecting, which had been left behind in ages past to aid those who would fight the forces of chaos. Few civilizations survived the twin scourges of the orc assaults and chaos corruption, and the population that remained often perished at the hands of one or the other. Yet the orc invasion, though destructive, was merely a smokescreen. Beneath the clamor of the greenskin warbands, a warband of Alpha Legion Chaos Space Marines commanded by the Chaos Lord Baal and the Chaos Sorcerer Sindir Mir slipped into the planet undetected, seeking the Maledictum, an ancient, incredibly powerful chaotic relic buried beneath the capital city. Captain Angelos, guided by the twin blessings of instinct and experience, disregarded cautionary warnings from the Ordo Malleus Inquisitor Mordecai Toth, sensing that there was more to the conflict than meets the eye. In the ensuing hunt, Angelos discovered that the forces of Baeltan Eldar had arrived, intent on resealing the demon bound within the Maledictum. The ensuing clash was catastrophic, with the Blood Ravens breaking the back of the Eldar defenders, slaying an avatar of Cain, and decimating many of their warriors. Still, Sindir succeeded in securing the Maledictum and its key, setting the stage for an attempted ascension to demonhood. The most regrettable betrayal came not from an alien or a traitorous enemy, but from within. Librarian Iskander Aikos, once Angelos' initiate, succumbed to the corruptive lure of the Maledictum and handed it to Sindir, believing himself in control while the truth had been that he was manipulated from the very start. Angelos confronted Archios in personal combat, vanquishing the traitor. However, while this occurred, Sindir harnessed the Maledictum to begin his transformation into Demon Prince, but Angelos ended the threat, shattering the artifact with a demon hammer forged from a shard of the Wailing Doom, the very blade that had slain the Avatar of Cain. Yet victory would be bittersweet due to the sheer bloodshed on Tartarus. Both Imperial and Xenos alike ended up empowering the trapped demon's awakening upon the artifact's very destruction. Its final whispered words hinted at a connection to Inquisitor Thoth, suggesting that the Inquisitor may not have been as pure as he had appeared. Angelos, pressed for time and survival, could pursue the matter no further, leaving this mystery unsolved and evacuating the planet of his forces. One of the next major incidents involving the Alpha Legion would be the ambush at Kruger Ridge. On Ignis Prime, Chapter Master Quelash Ickblood of the Excoriators came to inspect the mountaintop garrison of Kruger Ridge, only to find a scene of carnage. The garrison had been obliterated in an ambush orchestrated by the Alpha Legion Chaos Space Marines, who had arrived long before them. Within the Ocularium, Chapter Scourge Zachariah Crush fell to an insidious toxin known as Dorn's Darkness, failing both his master and his chapter, leaving the Alpha Legion unimpeded in their objectives. The Legion's goals were just as finicky as they were cruel. Their near-successful assassination of Akerbud, coupled with the theft of the Stygimatur, the revered chapter standard dating back to the second founding, and this act struck at the very heart of the Excoriators' morale. Ichablood was gravely wounded, as he was stuck, writhing in envenomed agony as the apothecarian struggled to counteract the toxin, which had no known antidote. Though the assassination would ultimately fail, its effects were lethal. The chapter master would eventually succumb much later to this poison. His death, while not immediate, was a testament to the Alpha Legion's preference and panache for manipulation, subterfuge, and poisoning over straightforward combat. Then would come the Guruvara campaign, occurring at an unknown date in M41. The campaign for the Guruvara system unfolded as a veritable maelstrom of war, where the Blood Ravens found themselves engaged not with a single enemy, but with nearly every major threat the galaxy could muster against them. Within this battlefield stood the Astra Militarum, devoted forces of the Order of the Sacred Rose, of the Adeptus Sororitas, orcs under the relentless Wa of Gorguts, Eldar of the craft world Ulthwé, Dark Eldar of the Cabal of the Black Heart, Chaos Space Marines of the Alpha Legion, led by a coronate champion known as Fiverus Charon, and even the Tau, all coalescing on a single spot. Adding to this calamity, Necrons of Guruvara III, a tomb world buried for millions of years, had awakened under the command of their newly risen Necron Lord, and descended upon the battlefield with the cold and calculated inevitability of millennia. This outcome was disastrous, as the Blood Ravens suffered grievous losses. Captain Indrik Borella and the entirety of his 5 companies vanished amidst the chaos. Beyond that, Imperial records remain frighteningly opaque, leaving historians and strategists alike to piece together the events from fragmentary reports. In the aftermath, the Guruvara system became a cautionary tale of overexertion, misfortune, and the hazards of fighting too many foes at once, especially foes who, according to rumor, may or may not have coordinated amongst themselves. The Alpha Legion seemingly having orchestrated forces that would never work together to not only coexist, but to form an assault on multiple fronts in a coherent sense. The final major incident of galactic note involving the Alpha Legion occurred between 001 and 025 M42. In the wake of the Great Rift, the galaxy's fabric was torn asunder, and the stability of the Imperium was left crippled. Amongst the forces seeking dominion over the strategically vital worlds of Vigilus in the Imperium Nihilus were Alpha Legion Heretic Astartes, operating in concert with other allies of Abaddon the Despoiler. Their participation, though often unrecorded to their full detail, served to complicate the defenses of Vigilus, as Vigilus would undergo a series of uprisings and what appears to be sabotage as the forces of chaos sow chaos wherever loyalist forces sought to assert control. In tandem with this would be the Nest of the Serpents, an incident occurring in M42, and perhaps no modern operation more aptly demonstrates the Alpha Legion's true talent than such. As the Great Rift ripped into existence, billions of mortal eyes turned to the stars, only to find confusion and fear mirrored in every shadow. Across countless worlds, serpent cells and hypnotically conditioned agents blinked into action, their mental imperatives triggered by the Legion's long-seated plans. A wave of anarchy swept through the Imperium as citizens already restricted from gazing into the night sky due to reactionary laws enacted after the Great Rift's appearance now found their worlds in turmoil. In the wake of this confusion, the Alpha Legion's operatives transformed riots into full-scale wars as dozens of worlds fell swiftly to their machinations. All the while, hidden cults spread heresy, drawing Imperial forces away from strategic targets, allowing the Alpha Legion's primary forces, or what we might call them as illusionary strike teams, struck targeted critical locations with devastating force. Unlike other traitor legions, most of the Alpha Legion does not linger in the warp. Instead, they move through the galaxy as scattered autonomous warbands, allowing each of them to both act and react in accordance to not only their own will but the greater will of the whole, each cell trained to operate independently towards a shared, unknowable goal. This decentralization may explain why they have largely avoided the mutations of chaos, possibly reflecting some lingering loyalty to the greater desires of the Emperor of Mankind, in particular the perpetuation of humanity for as long as possible. Or it may just be another misdirection by the ever so confounding Legion. The Legion's activities have earned them the undying wrath of the Inquisition and the hatred of the Ordo Malleus and the Ordo Hereticus, who have dedicated vast resources to hunting down any and all of their hidden enclaves. The High Lords of Terra, on no fewer than 3 occasions, have declared the Alpha Legion fully exterminated, once in the 31st millennium, again in the 32nd millennium, and yet a third time in the 39th millennium, yet each time a new Alpha Legion inspired plot or a new cell emerges somewhere across the Imperium, proving that much like the Hydra, for every head they cut off, two more will rise and take its place. Though whether those heads were ever truly connected is a question that the Imperium and historians must hazard to ask. In conclusion, one of the most chilling lines attributed to Alpharius comes from the novelization of his own origin, and it goes as follows: I am Alpharius, immediately echoed by the revelation of "this was a lie." This paradoxical proclamation in one of the few sources of knowledge that is supposedly concrete records of the 20th Legion's legacy leaves no shadow of a doubt that the identity of the very Legion is an illusion. Loyalty, misdirection, and truth as a weapon, whether it's truly deceased or whether he is still out there, hidden behind a mask of subterfuge, is one of many of the mysteries that the Alpha Legion has lain, and that the Imperium has yet to solve.